Hi, this is Paul. I know a lot of you clicked on this video because of the title, and some of you will leave this video right away because don't have 3 or 4 points to just justify this claim. But for those of you who are used to my channel, you know what's coming. And just to give you fair warning, this is one of these inklings that I have, and I think I have evidence for it, but I'm still very much working out the ideas. And so if you clicked on this video for a finished argument, boom, 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 there it is, that you can feel validated by or push back against or hate, you might as well click away now. Because what's coming at you is a lot of wondering and a lot of nuance and a lot of listening. Well, let's get into it. So that's just a warning, because I know with a title like this, some of you are going to click on it and you're, what now? And within 30 seconds, you're gone. I look at YouTube analytics. I understand that. And I'm totally good with that. I know YouTube wants me to produce content that will keep you here for the whole 2 hours. But that's not how I use my channel. I use my channel to think out loud. And around my channel is a group of similarly insane people who like to hear me think out loud and write back to me in the comments section in other different ways. So here we are. Why marriage equality leads to the death of Protestant churches. Now, that word Protestant is really important there. And I know for you Orthodox and Roman Catholics, you're going to cheer. And for Protestants, some of you are going to be angry because, no, marriage equality is the future of the Protestant church. Could be. I don't know. When I'm asked about this issue often, I say, we don't have anywhere near enough time to know the answer to this. And I stick by that answer. But I've got inklings, and I've had some thoughts over the last couple of weeks that I want to share with you about this. Now, on a video I recently made, when I made the comment about the end of new atheism, somebody said, no, atheism is on the rise. Read the studies more carefully. The nuns are on the rise. And actually getting at how to categorize people on these ideas, it's tremendously difficult, if not pointless. The point is that many, many people in North America are leaving the church as their, let's say, spiritual practice. I'll use that language. And the nuns are rising. But that doesn't mean nuns give up spiritual practice. They're spiritual but not religious. Then we have the fun with the definition of religion. And so there's all kinds of things. And again, for those of you who listen to my channel a lot, you know all this stuff. What is true is Rod Dreher, a few years ago, wrote a piece that basically said the last Episcopalian has already been born. And that was following, and some of you say, oh, that's Rod Dreher, he's an alarmist. Okay. That was following, as many of Rod Dreher's articles are, Philip Jenkins, who has written some very interesting history books, who was writing on the Patheos blog, not at all as an evangelical, just making the point that the mainline church has been falling through the floor. And the mainline church has been the part of the church that has been most enthusiastic, in fact, most demanding about marriage equality. And everybody, in fact, if you're in sort of a moderate denomination like mine, the Christian Reformed Church of North America, there's a lot of anxiety about not embracing marriage equality in order to keep the youth, because many young people who grew up in Christian Reformed homes are saying, I'm not going to go to a church that's bigoted. Or if my church won't accept my gay friends, I want no part of it. And so the Christian Reformed Church, whose median age I think is already in the 50s, it's a church in many ways that I think is facing a terminal death. Probably, I think it'll come quicker because of this fight. But this argument is that this is going to save the church, when all of the data from the Presbyterian Church of the USA, from the Episcopalian Church, from the United Methodists, is that this fight is a killer. And this fight will take your church out. Now, do I mean local church or denomination? I'm a little fuzzy on that here in terms of the title of this video, but in either case, Now some will say, well, there's some large, thriving, even affirming megachurches. Fair enough, but they're the exception that in some ways proves the rule. And again, I go back to my previous position that I don't know that we've been with these questions long enough to really have much perspective on them at all in terms of many of the frames that we're dealing with them within. But I think this is true. I think I can give you some plausible reasons why marriage equality leads to the death of Protestant churches. And a lot of these reasons are not along the lines that you usually hear Protestants say, such as, well, the Bible says so, or they're rebelling against God. I'm not arguing with those religious reasons, okay? That's not the point of this video. The point of this video is I'm going to be speaking to a much broader perspective, at least broader in terms of how we tend to conceptualize it in secular society. Jordan Peterson would say some psychological reasons for it. Now, I'm not a psychologist, so I won't claim to speak with authority on psychology, but there are some things that I see that I want to share. And I've been trying to figure out how to make a video about this for about 2 weeks now. Now, there are a matrix of ideas in my mind that are undeveloped, which is why I make videos. And again, that's why I gave the disclaimer right at the top of the video, if you're still watching, that if you're expecting 5 clean points about why marriage equality leads to the death of Protestant churches, if you're expecting the video version of some listicle, you've come to the wrong channel, because I just don't do that. And I don't do that for a lot of reasons that I'm not going to go into right now, because I'm already way too ADHD. But this is why I make videos, because I need to think out loud to think through these things. I've been writing on CRC Voices, which is decades-old listserv that I've participated on, partly because in that listserv there are good friends of mine, like Len Vandezee, who's been on this channel, who's a part of All One Body. And Len and I think differently about a number of things, but I very much love and trust and respect Len. And CRC Voices is one of the few places I know where we can actually have a significant, productive conversation about issues like this, because in most places in the Christian Reformed Church and in most places in society at large, those spaces to have a productive conversation are shutting down fast. Because, well, people have already made up their minds, and that's fair. Well, I'm very high in openness, and so even after I've come to working conclusions and decisions about things, my mind is still open about these things. And so even though most Christian Reformed ministers have decided what side of this debate that they're on, and by the way, most of them are traditional, should come as a surprise to nobody who has any deep understanding of the Christian Reformed Church, I still think about it, just like I still think about women in office, and what the experience of the Christian Reformed Church has been with experimenting on women in office since the late 90s. So there's more going on in the death of the Mainline than just marriage equality, okay? Because marriage equality, I think, is the expression of another ideal beneath the church that has become an implicit confession that I think is unstable and finally untenable, and I think it's for the end, and I think actually it makes the church unnecessary. The Mainline church peaked during the Cold War, and there were deep reasons for that. And with the end of the Cold War, the church has been in incredibly steady decline. And there are lots of reasons for that, far beyond marriage equality. But I think embracing marriage equality is sort of a poison pill for, again, I'm going to say it, Protestant churches. I'm limiting my analysis to that group. Now, those of you who are Orthodox and Roman Catholic, I'm sure you'll glean from this video a bunch of points that you'll probably use in fighting your own little intramural fights. But as I get into this, there's a dynamic aspect of this that is deeply connected with Protestantism. All right. Now, there might also be a deep connection between how and why and what kinds of groups we create to achieve what certain sorts of things in our lives. And that's actually a lot of what this video is about. And this is why I'm going to be playing again some video that I've commented on, which is Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pejo's conversation. But now, after Jonathan had that conversation, he messaged me and was very excited about the conversation, And I, after watching the video, wasn't as excited about the conversation. Now, that's a sort of a regular experience for me. I remember watching the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris talks and initially feeling sort of frustrated, but the longer I sat with them, the more value I saw in them. And that's probably... That's a fairly common pattern with me, and I think that pattern is because we have to initially see things in low resolution, and given time, the value of things begins to emerge and sort of seep up from them. And I think that's very much true of the Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pejo conversation, even though I think probably that was his best conversation in the second wave. I'm going to talk about why marriage equality, and I'm using the term that most people who promote it want to use, and there's a reason for that term. And I have a lot more ideas about the relationship between hierarchy and equality and how Jesus and Christianity completely rewrote human history in terms of that polarity. But in this thing, why marriage equality destabilized... why is marriage equality destabilizing to the traditional marriage ideal and some of the consequences of that? And again, I'm not going to go to the Bible and pull up verses and say, well, we're going to appeal to biblical authority to make this argument. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to appeal to reason. So those of you who don't like the Bible or don't like Christianity or don't like religion, well, there's something in this video for you because I'll be using reason. How do aspirations, desires, and ideals work together to form voluntary organizations? That idea is key in this, and this is where this begins to intersect with my thinking about the rise and fall of Mars Hill, my reading about of Wellman's book. I'm gonna have to learn his name. Basically, God as a drug. Does Protestantism use the state for its implicit two-speed religion? Now, some of you might remember over the course of this channel, I've talked a lot about one-speed and two-speed religion, taking that from Charles Taylor's Secular Age. And, I've gotten a fair amount of pushback on that from Mary and from other Roman Catholics, and Orthodox haven't really talked to me about that issue. But this issue for me sort of energizes that because there's a strange alignment between Protestantism, the rise of the nation state, Protestantism, and the change, sort of the modernization of the monarchy, which sounds strange, but actually makes sense when you think about it, because the kind of monarchies that we saw in early modern Europe, I think, were in some ways a combination of the ability to create monarchical nation states, whereas prior to modernity, I forget what, I think I got this from The Rest is History. Prior to modernity, monarchy was sort of first among equals, that there were lords and the monarch was one of the lords, and that was sort of the monarchy. And actually there's a parallelism in Protestant churches with respect to elder rule and whether the pastor is an elder or not. So there's a lot of interesting complexity below the surface, but there that is. Now, again, as I mentioned, last week, instead of making videos, I spent a fair amount of time doing some writing on CRC Voices. And the kind of writing I do on CRC Voices, it's full of typos, and it's all completely first draft, and it's right off the top of my head. It's basically like my videos. And before I made videos, I had CRC Voices and my blog, and I would just write and dump things there, and I dump it on the poor folks on CRC Voices and leave it for them to sort out, which they usually do kindly because it's a small group and we all know each other and love each other and fight like family. That's what we do on CRC Voices. We fight like family. But that fight on CRC Voices is very much parallel to the bigger fight in the Christian Reformed Church, where we're fighting like family over the question of marriage equality and whether the Christian Reformed Church should recognize same-sex marriages in the way that first the Canadian government and the American government did. And in a lot of ways, that's what this fight is about. And there's let's call them a political action group in the Christian Reformed Church called All One Body, which is made up of a lot of people I know and care about. Because remember, I'm really from the CRC left. And so they're making videos, and they're making videos explaining why they think what they think. And right now, they're doing it because in 2016, see, the pattern in the Christian Reformed Church, which makes sense in a Protestant church, has always been, well, we're going to go to the Bible to figure out what to do. And between the 70s and the 90s, they worked that really hard over the question of whether or not women should be allowed to serve in ecclesiastical office. And it didn't arrive anywhere. And so finally, the church sort of gave up on it because, this is going to come later in the video, because many conservatives, not all, and moderates and progressives could agree it was not a confessional issue. And so the Christian Reformed Church basically said local option with respect to women in church office. And in classes, which are the mid-level judiciaries, the regional assemblies, classes could decide whether or not to seat women elders and pastors based on vote. And then synod would allow women to be at the binational assembly once a majority of classes seated women at classis. And that happened in the mid-90s. And I was actually I was a delegate to the first synod where women were seated. And I'm not going to make a video right now on my thoughts about women in office, but I've not opposed it. Okay? And in fact, in practice, I've been a part of helping a number of women find their way into professional ministry. And some of you notice that on the church channel sometimes, every now and then, there'll be a woman preacher at Livingstone's. And, okay, go ahead and post those comments. That's fine. Like I said, even though I make decisions about things, I still think about them. And that makes people uneasy because it's like, I want you to be open until you arrive at my position and then lock the door and bolt it. Well, I'm not really that way. So All One Body has been around for a while, but the Christian Reformed Church, many imagined that the Christian Reformed Church would just borrow the women in church office playbook to deal with the question of same-sex marriage as it was legalized in the United States and Canada. And so there have been series of synodical reports on homosexuality, all sorts of things, the 73 report, I think 99, 2000, and ever since really the 21st century, the focus has been on pastoral care. That's sort of been the camel's nose to get into these conversations. And so a report came in 2016 to Synod on pastoral care, trying to give advice to the churches. And as happened in the women in church office fights in the 70s to the 90s, there was a majority and minority report. Now, I don't want to bog you down in synodical procedural minutia, which is part of church polity and part of maintaining a denomination, but basically, Synod 2016 saw what was coming because of its experience with women in church office and said, we don't want to go down that road. Because if we keep having successive synodical committees to give us answers from the Bible and theology and science about what we should do with this topic, we're going to keep having majority and minority reports. And we're going to wind up sort of like we wound up with women in church office at, deciding on a practical compromise that will basically get this off the synodical docket. Now, again, part of this has been from watching the Reformed Church of America, the denomination that the Christian Reformed Church split off of in the 19th century. The Reformed Church in America was the daughter of the state church in the Netherlands, the church that in the 19th century, the Dutch version of the Christian Reformed Church split off of. And the Christian Reformed Church had been watching the Reformed Church of America just in agonizing forever conflict over this issue and said, we don't want to go down that road either. So we're not going to do just another synodical report. We're going to jigger the committee. And so you can find videos about that on the All One Body website too. And they said, we are only going to put people on this next synodical committee who affirm the traditional position. And in that way, we're not going to get a majority-minority report that basically kicks it to Synod, and for Synod to say, no, we're not going down the road of affirming or inclusion. Now, the progressives, of course, are sort of hoping that the overall sea change in the countries will continue to change people's minds and open people up to the idea of marriage equality in the Christian Reformed Church. And in time, because that's sort of the progressive ethos and assumption, in time, the Christian Reformed Church will embrace marriage equality. That's the idea behind All One Body. And they're just following the Women in Office playbook. But of course, the conservatives in the Christian Reformed Church said, we don't like how the last thing went. So guess what? We're not going to follow the playbook. And so then All One Body. So basically, in 2020, Synod 2020, the Human Sexuality Report, abbreviated HSR, Human Sexuality Report, was released, and it was a conservative report. Obviously, because that's the committee they put together. And it's 170 pages. So if you want to read it, it's free on the internet. I'll leave a link below and you can find it, as I'll leave a link to the All One Body website. And of course, we've had COVID, so we've had 2 synods delayed, and so it's going to come to Synod 2022 if that one happens. See how many Greek letter variants we'll have of COVID going down the road. But right now, so the strategy for All One Body, it's really a 2-pronged strategy. One prong is defeat the Human Sexuality Report, because the thing that the report does is basically state at the end of it that subscription to traditional marriage is a confessional issue. That's a game changer, and that's different from the Women in Church Office debate, because now suddenly Christian Reformed ministers and office bearers that are pro-marriage equality might find themselves liable to church discipline. Nobody really expects that to happen, though. Now, I mentioned that there's a 2-pronged approach. One is to make sure that this doesn't happen, that the Human Sexuality Report is defeated. So they're devoting a big YouTube video campaign to try to defeat that. Now, at least from the videos I've seen so far and the numbers on them, I'm going to give them the biggest bump they're going to get. At the same time, the other prong is, as I've mentioned before in some previous videos, that some churches in Classis Grand Rapids East, most specifically Neeland Avenue, ordained a lesbian deacon to office. And it's the way Christian Reformed polity works. There was a test case in Toronto a number of years ago, and basically Classis Toronto sort of agreed to handle First CRC Toronto's question about ordaining a gay elder in probably in a same-sex marriage, because it happened in Canada earlier. And the CRC, this cry went up in the CRC, and Classis Toronto said, we'll handle it. Don't worry about anything. It won't happen. And it all went away, sort of. But Classis Grand Rapids East, they've written a document about it. The Classis itself is split on it. The churches themselves are split on it. If Synod 2022 says to Classis Grand Rapids East, shut it down, Classis Grand Rapids East says no. And then Synod says, we're going to find the synodical machinery to, in fact, shut down your Classis and that church. Already there's been fights on the internet about whether or not Synod has that power. So, yeah, this is a really big fight in the Christian Reformed Church. And because of the way it went with Women in Church Office, the question is whether or not there are enough votes to actually pursue discipline. And in some ways, all one body is counting on there not being, because that's sort of been the strategy in the Reformed Church of America and in other Protestant denominations, where the church polity is loose enough that you can allow sort of these movements to grow. And what happens then at some point is conservatives get tired enough, so they leave the denomination and form little denominations of their own, or join other conservative denominations that basically have it written in that they oppose it. And if you bleed off enough conservatives, maybe the progressives will have enough votes to carry the day. Or maybe people just won't care enough about the denomination, and there'll be little, as there are in, let's say, the Presbyterian Church of the USA, there'll be little churches around that sort of shrug their shoulders at it, say, we're sort of denominational, but not really. We really mostly care about our little church, and as long as the denomination doesn't bother us and costs us too much, we'll leave it alone. And in denominations like the PCUSA, churches that have wanted to leave for ECHO and other evangelical Protestant Church of America, EPCA. I mean, this is all Protestant acronyms on this stuff. The denomination has basically taken local churches, significant church here in Sacramento that went through this fight, taken them to court saying you can't leave. You can leave the denomination, but you can't take your building with you, which is tremendously offensive to local churches, because they say, you didn't pay for this church, we did. And so churches like Fremont Pres in Sacramento sort of paid for their building twice. In fact, they paid more for it the second time, because they had to give some kind of settlement based on market value. And when they built the building, probably in the 60s, the property values were far less than they are right now in Sacramento today. So the whole thing has been this enormous mess in Protestantism. And I know you Roman Catholics have your own little tremors about these things. And of course, Rod Dreher found Roman Catholicism insufficiently serious so as to hop over to the Orthodox. And I know that Rod Dreher is not alone. So yeah, there's a lot going on here. And again, this is about Protestant churches. Now, Byrne sent me this video. Byrne Power has his own station, the Anadromist. Sent me this video with Tim Keller, because he knows I'm a big Tim Keller fan. Tim Keller and Kevin DeYoung, two celebrity PCA. Now, PCA is Protestant Church in America. They're a conservative denomination that doesn't allow women in church office, and certainly has been conservative on these human sexuality issues. But that's even shaking the PCA. That's something. PCA is more conservative than the Christian Reformed Church if you're looking at these kinds of metrics. And both Tim Keller and Kevin DeYoung used to be a pastor in the Reformed Church of America in Lansing, Michigan. And like I said before, part of the dynamics is he just got fed up with the Reformed Church of America fighting about this, so he joined the PCA. He was a celebrity pastor in the Reformed Church of America. Again, this now bleeds over into the rise and fall of Mars Hill, mega churches, etc., etc. So he's now a member of the PCA. He and Tim Keller, as they note earlier, have a variety of issues that they differ on. Tim Keller is sort of if you can be a liberal in the PCA, Tim Keller is it. And for that reason, there's lots of people in the PCA who don't like Tim Keller, because he's soft on a lot of things that someone like, let's say, Kevin DeYoung is hard on. Probably shouldn't have said it that way, especially with a video like this. But you know what I mean. And I listened to this video, and parts I could agree with, parts I didn't agree with. It'd be very interesting, some of you Orthodox and Roman Catholics listening to it. I mean, the Presbyterian Church in America, the PCA, is a very serious church when it comes to its theology. In some ways, in different ways, a little bit differently, and this is some of the difference between the English Presbyterian and the Dutch Calvinists, okay? And notice DeYoung, Dutch name from the RCA, so there's some differences here. But Tim Keller is, he's a big fan of the Heidelberg Catechism. He's a big fan of the Dutch Reformed. So Tim Keller actually has a little bit of Dutch Reformed DNA floating around in his theological matrix too. Anyway, the PCA celebrity pastors, they had a group that crafted 12 statements, and they walked through those statements in this little video. And They even commented about this video might be too long, and I said, psh, 49 minutes? Ah, putzes. But they have a point. I understand that point. Protestants tend to default to what does the Bible say we should and shouldn't do. Americans tend to default to that. And again, if you go back to, it's no longer on the BioLogos website, which is a shame. Mark Knoll wrote really a wonderful piece a number of years ago that I basically downloaded and kept in my files, because one of the things you learn if you try to use the internet as a filing cabinet is that stuff gets taken down. So if you want some things, you better make copies of it. There's the Wayback Machine, I know. What does the Bible say we should and shouldn't do? And again, within the PCA, even within the CRC, that's a big part of these fights. But as I said, because of the Women in Church Office fight, part of why this fight is threatening Protestantism as such, and again, I hear you Roman Catholics and Orthodox cheering, is because does sort of the Protestant way of dealing with the multi-factor spiritual authentication, does it really work? That's still a very open question for Protestants. And a lot of Roman Catholics and Orthodox look over the fence and say, no, it doesn't work. Look at you. Over here on the Protestant side of the fence, I look over at the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox, I say, all right, I see our weaknesses, but you got some of your own there too. So I'll get to that, like really to the end of the video if you last that long. Now, most of the looky-loos have left, so it's mostly just us now. I've been really enjoying this book by James Wellman Jr., Tripp's uncle. Funny how these things happen. High on God. I don't know how much I like the title. How Megachurches Won the Hearts of America. That's a good subtitle. The beginning of the book, part 1. I might read a lot of this book in the courses of my videos because so today I just released my conversation from yesterday with John Vervaeke and J.P. Marceau. And often when I'm in those conversations, I feel like the guy who has to translate for regular folks. But that's what pastors do. So, because, J.P. and John Vervaeke can be off there in the stratosphere, throw Pejo in there, and they're just talking ancient fathers and philosophy and all these things way the heck up there, and a lot of people's eyes just glaze over. Yeah, I know, there's Nate Heil out there, and he's eating it with a spoon. Not everybody reads that much philosophy and history, so I don't read as much as them, but I don't know as much as them, but I try to be a little helpful in translating. And there's a lot of translating that actually needs to be done in Wellman's book. And if that's a critique I have of the book, actually, that a book like this is sort of pitched to a general audience. I don't think this book is terribly accessible to a general audience, but it's accessible enough to me. But let's get started. Caught my attention right away when part 1, the title of part 1 is Desires the Heart of Religion. Now there's a lot in there, especially because this week I'm preaching on the second, kind of the last part of the argument in the book of Galatians. So if you're following on my sermons, my Sunday sermon went particularly well, a lot better than the first draft. And John Van Donk was in church, and he said he liked my sermon. He says, normally you're just sort of a moderate preacher, but this was a really good one. So if you're curious about how the sermon went, I haven't cut it out of the service and posted it separately, but you can go over to the church YouTube, the links below, the church YouTube page, and if you don't like the music, just scroll through the music. It's easy to find where I start preaching, but I thought the sermon went well. Anyway, desire is the heart of the religion. Why do I say desire is sort of strange? Because if you read the Apostle Paul, this desire is often a problem. You hear that in Pejo, that it's our sinful desires. But desire as such in Christianity is not a bad thing. And of course, Augustine knew this. Even John Piper knows this. Desiring God is the name of his first book that really put him on the celebrity pastor map. Desire is a big thing. We're not human beings without desire. And again, in an Augustinian frame, desire is all about desiring the right things and not the wrong things. Ordered desires. And you can hear that from Pejo, and for Roman Catholics, it's pretty Desire's the heart of religion, and you don't commit to. Religious communities are not built without desire, and they're desiring something. That's in many ways the heart of this video, and why marriage equality, I think, means death to the Protestant churches. Because in some ways, I think they destabilize Protestant churches in such a way that the kinds of effects that we're seeing, again, this isn't the only variable in the decline of the mainline, but the kinds of effects that we see happening, the way mainline churches are playing out in America, I think is partly due to this. Because anybody who is a pastor in a church knows marriage issues, relational issues. I mean, if there's one thing that traditional Christians struggle with, it's sexuality. Should come as no surprise. And again, the answer of the culture sort of was, then give up your strictures. We're going to deal with that later in this video, because that isn't happening. The governor of New York resigned. Don't talk to me about giving up strictures. We're inventing rules around sexuality at an enormous clip because we sort of abandoned one rule. And so now, one good rule is more than 1,000 weak ones. Anyway, back to this. Desire is the heart of religion. In part one, we will make the case that desire for emotional energy, and again, some of the language in this book, is that really the right word? But he's trying to talk about really difficult things in this book. And again, he's trying to do it in an accessible way. And that is really, really hard. And so, if there's one thing that I do in my videos, it's try to come up with language to talk about things that are really difficult to talk about. So we make the case that desire for emotional energy is at the heart of religion. Now, again, I don't think that's a great sentence, but I think he's right. Because I think I know what he's pointing to, and I don't necessarily have a better sentence than his right now, but I want one. And if I talk long enough, I hope I'll get one. So, humans seek emotional energy. Again, emotional energy, yeah. And this energy is the drug or force that catalyzes sociality. Again, I think he's right. I just don't like the language he's using. I don't think it really grabs. I mean, what did Peterson do? Peterson had the right words at the right time that just exploded. That's what the right words will do. That's how important it is to look for the right words. That's what theologians do all the time, as do authors. This force feeds humans' fundamental needs. Again, they're fundamental needs, and this is where we're going to get into Peterson. Because these are fundamental needs. We can't live without them. You can live without creature comforts far quicker than you can live without these. And, meaning is in that group. But also emotional satisfaction for joining with others. Again, this isn't, and this is sort of the weakness of an individual society. And then he uses Durkheim, and I think this is really, really helpful. And this sums up the problem of homo duplex. Humans desire to be independent, masters of their own universe, sui generis individuals. And that's sort of the sui generis from, that's sort of the secret sacred self. That's that vision that down inside of me, there's a secret sacred self. If I could somehow fully manifest in my life, then the kingdom comes. Then I'm in heaven. Then I've arrived. I've achieved. Then we've arrived at the summum bonum, the greatest of all goods. That's sort of the cult of the secret sacred self. But they desperately need to do this in and through others. And this is why churches and people in churches demand that their churches reflect back to them, mirror back to them their positions. And it fuels YouTube. I look at YouTube channels that maybe I'll name names. I look at YouTube channels that, well, not this channel. Something like this channel. Alyssa Childers. Now, some of you really like her channel, I'm sure, because there's some alignment between my positions and her positions. But this video was through, and discerning the popular Christian podcast in the country, positives and cautions. And I find these channels dull, boring. Why? Because they're so completely predictable, but yet they're really popular. Well, why are they really popular? And if I was a little bit more right down the line along certain evangelical or cultural or dogmatic lines, my channel could be more popular. But I keep saying things that annoy you, and I'm like a bionic mosquito buzzing around you, except I'm not talking about natural law. I wanted to get bionic mosquito in the video somehow. And so that's part of the reason my channel skews, because if people who hang with my channel are usually pretty high in openness. So, she just has this video about Mars Hill, and she runs through all the pretty common pedestrian points. And fair enough, make a video. But people eat this stuff up because it's like, it's part of the reason why Jordan Peterson rose, is because he was saying things better than people could. And so what was happening is they were getting mirrored back to them what they already believed, but it was sort of like an improvement mirror where they looked prettier in the mirror through the words of the other person than they felt themselves to be. And that's what many channels like this do. And, fine. I'm just not interested in that, because after I've heard one or two of her videos, I can almost guess, although I was a little bit surprised. She identified it as a complementarian, but she said that, like the Christian Reformed Church, that's kind of the moderate evangelical posture that, women in church office is sort of something of adiaphora, which means you can be one way or another and still sort of be within the Overton window of what is acceptable. So, but the reason I don't watch a lot of channels like this is because they don't give me anything new, and I like new things. So again, nothing against her or her channel, but they fulfill the function, and they derive their audience from the improvement mirror. See, this is why I do this, to come up with language, from sort of the improvement mirror approach, which generates a lot of church commitment. Because in a consumerist society with voluntary organizations, people select churches that do that for them, among other things. So, yeah. Because, again, back to this. The sum of the problem of homo duplex, humans' desire to be independent, I gotta be me, masters of their own universe, sui generis individuals, but they desperately need to do this in and through others. In the process of achieving this cooperation, affective energy, and again, that's really good technical language, but I think it'll go over the heads of most readers, unless you've read maybe some Jonathan Edwards or some John Piper, learned about Jonathan Edwards. The affective energy produced, which penetrates and swirls between bodies, creating literal bodies in the context of a worship service, quite literally a drug-like experience. Now, that language gets our attention because drugs are a big deal, but almost anyone will tell you, the drugs on the outside, getting them into the inside, it's because our experiences are made up of drugs that are already in there, and the drugs outside just sort of blunt force the experience in our head, which is why I don't think psychedelics, I'm skeptical about psychedelics. I'm not going to go back down the psychedelic route. I've got videos on that. You can watch them. And an experience that has, in one form or another, sustained humans in groups across time and tradition. I think he's exactly right. He is exactly right. And what he does in the book is he points out, actually, mega churches are really effective drug delivery systems. I remember one of my friends who was planting a church here in Sacramento. He was starting his church in a movie theater, and I looked at that theater. I said, this is gonna make it really hard for your people to bond together as a body, because movie theaters are very intentionally, very skillfully designed to, even though you're with a crowd of people, to make you feel alone. The lights are low, the stage is bright, there's a central focus. These are all psychotechnologies, and they're powerful psychotechnologies. And so, you know, we all have our little shipping. And so at some point I want to have a conversation with James Wellman. Again, I don't usually do that with authors, or I usually not terribly excited about doing that with authors. But I have a conversation with James Wellman and John Vervaeke, because I think those two could have an interesting conversation. Anyway, because basically what he describes in the book is how megachurches are powerful psychotechnologies to deliver drugs. Well, they're not outside drugs, they're drugs inside our head. And that's part of the reason I think psychedelics are sort of a cheat. Because, now let's say you could become a master at meditation by taking a pill. Would you take it? A lot of people say, yeah. Well, let's say I could, bulk up with muscles far quicker by, taking a particular drug while I lift weights than just lifting weights alone. You say, oh yeah, we all know that. That's steroids. Yeah. There are other effects to steroids too. Unearned wisdom. Be careful of unearned wisdom. So, Jordan Peterson and Danica Patrick. I was beginning to wonder if I was done with Jordan Peterson. I came back from vacation and didn't really have any desire to listen to any of his more recent conversations. Now, I don't say that in a way that, like, someone in a romantic relationship, I'm done with you. No, not at all. Not at all. Anything like that. It just, and I know many of you have had the same thing because he was told me. He's kind of mapped territory. It's kind of getting repetitive. Kind of getting decadent. Don't listen to much Jordan Peterson anymore because he's kind of doing the same thing, saying the same thing, yada, yada, yada. And he talked to Danica Patrick, and it was on her channel. Now, why Danica Patrick? Just because she's hot? No, she is hot. But no, that's not why. Because actually my interest in Danica Patrick came through my interest in Aaron Rodgers. Well, what was my interest in Aaron Rodgers? Well, first it was fantasy football, because Aaron Rodgers is an amazing quarterback. And then I caught this news in, it was earlier. Aaron Rodgers got real about religion. He did so in Danica Patrick's podcast. And then it was, and I don't think I made a video about it, but I almost did. Because, of course, those of you who watch my channel know that deconstruction is part of this story. And actually, deconstruction is very much part of the story about why marriage equality is death to Protestant churches. Because any deconstruction story you hear in the West, almost everyone will include the issue of homosexuality. Why? I'm not really to the bottom of that one yet, but that's a huge issue for these people. Huge issue for these people. You hear it almost every time. Rhett and Link, almost all the celebrities. It's this issue. This is a really big deal, and I agree. It's a big deal. It's a tough one. It's really hard, and I'm not going to get too far into that in this video, but I want to deal with that at some point in a video. And some of you know who watch my videos, you might have to wait a long time until I actually do, but we'll see. But Aaron Rodgers grew up in a traditional Christian conservative family, and he deconstructed. And because my daughters have been home instead of sons, and we've been watching shows like The Bachelor and The Bachelorette, I know that Aaron Rodgers has a brother. What was his name? Jordan Rodgers. And Jordan Rodgers won JoJo's heart in one season of The Bachelorette. And they haven't married yet, or maybe they have married yet, just recently. So the dirty little secret about The Bachelorette is that it doesn't usually work. Shh. But And then Jordan Rogers, often in that episode, would talk about how there's a riff in his family, that somehow their more famous older brother, who is Aaron, is kind of moved away from the family. That's a very sad thing. That's a very sad thing. And as a father now of a whole bunch of 20-somethings, we've got lots of different opinions about lots of different things, but it would break my heart to have any of my children estranged from the family. I emotionally, that's harder on me than just about anything. So I've listened to 3 episodes of her podcast, the Aaron Rodgers one and the Jordan Peterson ones. And so then when Jordan Peterson was on her channel, I thought, this could be interesting. So I listened in. Now, I did a little bit more research right before this video because I didn't know if Rogers and Patrick were still together. They're not. And this is actually going to be, not between those two, but this is actually going to be part of my point. Because what we're really dealing with is a stable ideal. An archetypal, a stable archetypal ideal. And one of the things I learned from Jordan Peterson was archetypes are the kinds of things you can't get around because they've reached the limit. That's the archetypos. That's where the word archetype comes from. It comes from the Greek arche, which means first or foremost or top or head, and tupos, type, example. So this is the ultimate example. And we're going to get into that marriage formula. But so eventually on my CRC Voices writing, this idea emerged that traditional marriage is an archetypal ideal that functions within churches. And, well, what are churches? Well, again, go back to this book. Churches engage this homo duplex need where we need to be individuals and we need to be in community. And the complex dynamic between the individual and the community is foundational for human existence. And once you recognize that, you see it all the time and all over the place. So, oh shoot, I didn't put the link in. So I started listening to the Danica Patrick podcast with Jordan Peterson, knowing, well, one of the things I've been talking about on Twitter is buzzwords are holy words. Maybe we'll start at the beginning of the podcast because she's laying down her buzzwords. And her buzzwords are basically articulating her religious devotion. What is her religion? What is at her core? Well, let's listen.
This podcast exists because I love talking to people and I love going deep. The purpose is to plant seeds of inspiration.
Okay. Buzzwords are holy words. Plant seeds of inspiration. Now you're playing with the religious liturgy here. Now it isn't necessarily connected with a lot of the ways that people identify religion, but that's how it's functioning in her world. I got to check the sound level of this video.
We enter a space of vulnerability and relatability. And
vulnerability, relatability. Now, it's really interesting. I'm not going to play any of it, but if you go back through her archives and check out her conversation with then boyfriend Aaron Rodgers, all of her buzzwords come up. She has implicit within her, as we all do, you need it. We need this. Religious assumptions, presuppositions, in fact, some way to deal with homo duplex. We're going to get that from Wellman and Durkheim. This both the me us tension, and now there's lots of other things built into this, but all of these buzzwords that she's spinning out, those are her holy words. Okay.
What you realize is that we are so much more alike than we are different. To quote
Homo duplex.
Ram Dass, we're all just...
Oh, quoting Ram Dass. I see, people sometimes say, have you read any Ram Dass? No, I haven't. Have not. Should I? I don't know. There's a lot of people I should read, so I've not read any Ram Dass, but he's located in my imaginary sort of at the New Age. I mean, living in Northern California, he's just associated with a whole picture I have of friends of mine who I know where they're at sort of on a religious spectrum, and they read Ram Dass. So she's quoting from him.
Just walking each other home. And this show is just one step. I'm Danica Patrick, walking so much more alike than we are different. To quote Ram Dass, we're all just walking each other home. And this show is just one step.
So, holy words are buzzwords, buzzwords are holy words.
I'm Danica Patrick, and I'm pretty intense. Today on the show is someone that I am so excited about. I have been listening to his talks and his information for so long. His name is Dr. Jordan Peterson. He's a professor of psychology, a clinical psychologist.
Is Jordan Peterson more famous than Danica Patrick? I don't know. You tell me.
And author of best-selling books, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And now he has Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. So clearly we need a lot of rules for life because life is really...
If you lose foundational rules, rules multiply, and not in a good way.
Challenging. And that's a lot of what we talked about, is just how hard it is, how complicated it is. And then we get into self-awareness, which I think is just a huge thing.
Self-awareness. Holy words are buzzwords. Excuse me, buzzwords are holy words.
Become self-aware of something going on, facing it. I think we all want to get better, but it's a matter of how.
Okay, get better. See, then now now we're Rebel Wisdom, Chris Williamson. In secular society, we want to get better, but do we have an idea of, we definitely have ideas about better and worse, but it's all a little fuzzy, it's all a little foggy, and where do those ideas come from?
How do we figure out where we need to get better? Where are our blind spots?
How do we figure it out?
He's a fascinating human. If you've never heard of him, get ready. He's a straight down the barrel kind of guy, and I think you're going to like this.
Now, of course, I think I'm correct in this because I'm not a NASCAR fan either. I mean, she came to fame by being a female race car driver, and they're unusual. So she's and she's also extremely marketable because of her looks, but she was also a good driver, I assume. I don't know. I mean, someone in the comment will tell me. But no, I guess you retire from race car driving at some point, and so now she's doing podcasts and, make money as a celebrity. So she's doing podcasts. But it was very interesting that her conversation with Aaron Rodgers was very interesting because they were dating, and she's...
Wow. Hi, Jordan. How are you?
Hi, Danica. How are you doing?
I'm good, A. I've got some...
cheap Canadian jokes.
I have relatives that live in Canada, so I'm familiar with the Canadian accent. I love the Canadians.
And people really do say A all the time.
Oh, yeah, they do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a boot. It's really true.
Well, I can't hear that. Sounds like about to me, but
right,
people say it isn't. So.
And she must be from the American South, because if you live in a place like Michigan, Canadians are not that exotic. Sorry, Canada.
Thank you for the invitation.
Oh, thank you for doing it. This is, I don't think there's been an interview that I have been more excited about or prepared as much. And my preparation is not really like...
I want to know if she read Maps of Meaning and understood it, because that's a hard book.
It hasn't been just all the, since I knew we were doing this. I have been paying attention to your work and listening to you and watching YouTube videos for years and years. And I just think that you're brilliant. I think that you are, you have such an...
I have no idea when this was recorded. Fairly recently, he looks pretty good. Sort of the Peterson watch, how's he doing? You look for little signs.
Incredible scope. One of the things that's so amazing is how you are able to layer in so many different sources, whether it's religion or mythology or psychology, and you just blend them also comprehensively when you answer a question. And I just think it's brilliant. How are you able to take all of those sources and blend them together so smooth?
Well, my mind works in a theoretical way, I would say. I was talking with two psychologists yesterday, Steven Pinker and Jonathan Haidt, and Haidt seems to think like me. He has a kind of a master theory in some sense, and then he just plugs things into it, whereas Pinker remembers facts. He has an amazing memory. He's like a...
I really like this question, and I really like this answer. That's why I'm playing it. It's not terribly on topic, but I thought it was really good.
He's like an encyclopedia, and I'm not like that. Like, facts themselves don't really stick with me. I have a theory about things, and I just plug new pieces of information into it all the time, and it's one big story. And so I kind of know the story. I guess that's and that's how I think. And so if a topic elicits part of that theory.
And that's part of why he's such a good presenter, because he tells it as a story. And again, story is this enormous compression engine, and we're deeply wired and attracted to it.
Which I've been writing about and lecturing about for, 30 years, then I have something to say about it. I think it's something like what jazz musicians do. They have all sorts of riffs and tricks that they have stored up, and then they can improvise with them as needs be. And that seems to be how I think and how I lecture.
Well,
I'm always trying to build this theory and to cover new territory with it and to make it more comprehensive.
Well, what's that theory?
You start out with a great question, and this question is like, I just said I've spent my entire life long working on this, and I gotta get it down. Oh boy.
Well, I suppose in essence, it's a theory about the story that we look at the world through. Well, first of all, the theory is that we do look at the world through a story. And, people are very, very attracted to stories, right? Children will beg for a story. So there's something very particular about stories that compel us. And I mean, it's odd if you think about it. We'll pay to go watch a story. Doesn't matter if it hurts our feelings. It doesn't matter if it makes us anxious or upsets us. Any of those things. It doesn't matter. We're still so enthralled by it that we'll go expose ourselves to it. So stories must be extremely useful to us, unless you...
He is so different in this conversation than his conversation with Vervaeke. I mean, there's just night and day difference.
Just write that off as mere entertainment, which I don't think is very smart. And a story is about going from where you are to somewhere better, usually, and then about the catastrophes that might befall you along the way, the unexpected occurrences, and how those might resolve, and how that might change you, the way you look at the world, the way you interact with other people, either for the better or the worse. Better if it's a comedy, and worse if it's a tragedy. And so I've been trying to unpack what a story is. A simple story is just, a child might tell it. I went to kindergarten today. More complicated story is, I went to kindergarten today, but on the way a mean dog barked at me and I got real upset and I thought maybe I'd go home, but I decided to continue. Then you pat the child on the head and say, well, that was a good decision, right? That you stuck with your course despite the fact that you got waylaid by something frightening. And so the first story is I called it a normal story in my first book, and the second story, a revolutionary story. And so Exodus in the Old Testament is a revolutionary story, right? Because the Israelites...
Is he working on Exodus? One can only hope.
The Jews leave the tyranny, Egypt, and escape into freedom, but then everything falls apart into chaos. And then, at least in principle, they find their way again and move forward. It's a very powerful story.
That'll probably give us a little signal into what he'll do with Exodus. I think he just laid it out right there in terms of how he looks at Exodus mythologically or psychologically.
How can we know, because so many of these stories, whether they're from, ancient Egypt or like I went to Egypt earlier this year and hearing the story.
Interesting. She didn't want to say the Bible, I don't think, because again, now, well, why are we in this? Why are we talking about, why are we watching this woman when we're talking about marriage equality? Well, because I suspect, I don't know, and if some of you are Danica Patrick podcast fans, you'll probably tell me in the comment section that she and Aaron Rodgers and many others who have grown up in the United States, deeply impacted by Protestantism, have made this journey, which for them feels like moral improvement, into a position of embracing and, in fact, even demanding from our government marriage equality. And for many people, that's reason enough to look at the Bible and say, if the Bible got this wrong, again, this is a new atheist trope. If the Bible got this wrong, why does it have any credibility for you at all? That's a powerful argument. That argument has gone a long ways. And so what groups that are highly motivated, like church groups, to evolve on this point, because culturally it's such a defeater, have tried to do then is go to the Bible and say, we're going to find a biblical justification for same-sex marriage. Now, it's really difficult to not imagine, and I'll put on my new atheist shirt instead of my pineapple bombs, and say, that sounds really post hoc. That sounds like a sunk cost issue for you, because basically, if there is deep within you a religious kernel, I mean that in terms of software, a religious kernel that is operating, and that one of the things that gets manifest is marriage equality. Marriage equality is just obvious on the basis of this particular religious presupposition. Now, it's really hard to know what those religious presuppositions are, what those ideals are underneath, because there are many, many ideals beneath us fighting for supremacy. Or I can flip it, as in my conversation with Vervaeke and JP, there are many, many spirits above who are moving us like an Iowa cornfield. Because, as I said in the Vervaeke thing, the plants in the Iowa cornfield, how much do they know about the farmer? But they're just being plants. The farmer's dog in the Iowa cornfield, how much does the farmer's dog know about the farmer? A little bit more. But if you think about what a dog can know and how a dog might know and what consciousness might look like in a dog, not a lot. The farmer knows way more about the dog and the plant than the plant knows about the farmer, or the dog knows about the farmer. So there's a religious kernel underneath that's energized, and it's basically saying marriage equality is just obvious. And I think many of us, not all of us, I certainly do. I've got that religious kernel actively in me. It's been set in me by my culture, and I say, yeah, why? Because I love my wife, and I want to stay married to my wife until death do us part. And you've got same-sex attracted people. Why on earth would you rob them of the opportunity to know love and to enjoy life? Now, you can't really, I figured this out when I was writing on Voices too, you can't really use the word monogamous, or you're going to be into the patriarchy. Why? It's monogamous means one woman. Monogamy is the wrong word. It's pair bonding for life, something like that. But so a big part of the deconstruction, my guess, and I might be wrong, my guess for many people like Aaron Rodgers, Danica Patrick, is marriage equality is just obviously right and good. And to deny it is wrong and offensive. And it's because either you've got this position warring inside of you, as some of you do, I know, because you tell me. Others, that's your position. I've had many people say, I simply cannot be part of a church that does not embrace marriage equality. I understand that. I get that. But now, it's interesting again, she said, well, Egypt. No, you really mean the Bible. Because when he said Exodus, the force of that is not Egypt, it's the Bible. And it's the authority of the Bible and the value of the Bible. And again, if there's one thing Jordan Peterson did was turn a whole bunch of people onto the idea that the Bible has value and maybe even beyond value, authority. Now, part of the reason I'm playing this here is because what Jordan is about to do, and part of the reason I've been interested in Jordan Peterson right from the start, is I want to know how Jordan does what he does. And the only way I'm going to know how Jordan does what he does, and Jordan might not even be able to tell me exactly how he does what he does, at least not in every way that could be told in the manner of a sentence or a paragraph or even necessarily a book, because we're that complex. But I want to know how Jordan does what he does, and I want to know it not just propositionally, I want to know it procedurally, I want to know it, I want to be able to participate in it. Some of you see the Vervaeke 4P shining through there. And what he does right here and what's to come is, I mean, he's so practiced at it. That's when you find a master, and this is why, you know, if someone offers you a pill to achieve for you what years of meditation maybe you'd achieve through that, but you can get it through a pill, don't take the pill. Why? So you don't know what that pill's going to do for you. Just like if that pill will help me achieve in the gym in a year what it would take 10 years for me to achieve in the gym, well, 10, you know, don't take the pill. Your voice will get high. So just in these next few minutes, Jordan Peterson very subtly exhibits what he's such a master of. And you might say, well, what exactly is it? See, we're not sure because it's all sort of happening beneath the surface. But he does it right here. And when I watched this first part, it was like, yeah, that's why I paid attention to this guy. I know a lot of you say you only make videos about Jordan Peterson to get attention on YouTube. There are ways of getting attention on YouTube using Jordan Peterson that I have clearly not used because that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in learning and actually being able to do what Jordan Peterson does. But that's really hard. And it's not just a matter of doing it performatively. I want to do it authentically, which means that I need to integrate what Jordan Peterson has mastered into my already well-baked cake, my already well-developed matrix. And that's really hard. That's a lot harder than just duplicating Jordan Peterson performatively. But what he's about to do here is it. And so, well, how does this deal with marriage equality? Well, I'm going to get there. Okay? Just watch what he does now. Now, first of all, he set up, so she asked this question, and that's vital.
Stories in Egypt, because so many of these stories.
Very powerful story.
How can we know?
Right there. How can we know? I want to know the truth. I want to know it's real. I want to have knowledge so that I can what? I can achieve. She started off the podcast with, again, buzzwords are holy words. She started off the podcast with buzzwords. She wants, again, we're back to this fight over this word. We're back to theosis. She wants union with God. That's what she wants. And look at where she's looking right now. How can I know? Because Jordan, I've had glimpses that you might be someone who can help me. That's why I'm looking at Jordan. You can help me learn some things, Jordan. You can help me achieve some things. Now, I don't want to be racked with the physiological consequences of benzo withdrawal, but you clearly have some ideas that I need to know about. And again, I think these ideas have everything to do with why marriage equality means death to many Protestant churches?
Oh, because so many of these stories, whether they're
Story.
How can we know? Because so many of these stories, whether they're from, ancient Egypt or like I went to Egypt.
Ancient Egypt. It's so funny because I saw someone posted on one of my listservs about trouble in the Netherlands over the royal coach, which is all made of gold, and how that reminds everyone of slavery. Shouldn't the pyramids of Egypt remind everyone of slavery? Let's cancel the pyramids. But no, the Bible, but Egypt. Arche tupos, arche first, foremost, head. I'm not going to talk about the Bible. I want to talk about Egypt, spirituality, something non-exclusive. Egyptians weren't exclusive.
Earlier this year, and hearing the stories about Osiris and Isis and Horus and all of these different stories, but that or religious, even from the time that Jesus was around, when they
opening the door a little bit,
wrote these stories down many decades later.
Many decades later. What really do you know? How up to date are you on the question of the New Testament Gospels and inscripturation? Just answer for me the question of, was the Temple of Jerusalem still up when those were written? What form? Redaction? I mean, these are really complex questions.
How do we know?
There it is again. How do we know? Look where she's looking. Same thing.
If the story is real.
Real. There's that word. Now again, Jordan plays this. Again, this is what he's a master at. I mean, he's so used to it. It doesn't even. He'd probably do this in his sleep.
Because memory is poor.
Well, I think that's a very, very complicated problem, obviously. I mean, some forms of truth are factual. Scientific truths are factual. Other sorts of truths you act out. And you see if they work.
Now we're into Vervaeke 4P knowledge. Truth. What is truth?
Work. And so they're true in the sense that an arrow is true when it flies, or someone's heart is true, right? There's lots of variations of the idea of truth. And so Christian story posits a ideal at its center. And that's the story of Christ and everything about him. And the truth of that is to be discovered in action, as far as I can tell, and acting it out. It's a target for emulation and imitation.
Okay. Acting out. Now, if he'd come in this thing with a "What would Jesus do" bracelet on him, I don't think she'd have him on the podcast. But, Jordan coming right in under the radar, dropping these. I mean, there's just so much in that little answer that just opens things up, and he delivered it perfectly here.
It's not so much a description of objective reality, although it might also be that. But and so to believe it is to act it out, a kind of ethic. And part of what Christianity is a discussion about what constitutes the ideal that we should all act out. And that unites us around.
Right? It. Homo duplex. It unites us. It's the individual and it's the ideal. It unites us. It has to be acted out.
That ideal. And it also that we should all act out. And that unites us around that ideal. And it also structures our expectations.
It unites us around that ideal.
Because that unites us around that ideal. And it also structures our expectations because we're disappointed in ourselves and in other people whenever we don't manifest that ideal. Right? Your conscience bothers you. You feel guilty. You feel ashamed because you're not.
Now he's making it very phenomenological. He's making it very psychological because she can relate to this. And now if you wade in, no, I don't want to throw stones at Tim Keller here because him having this conversation with Kevin DeYoung was very much framed. And Tim Keller part of what Tim Keller's skill was doing similar things to Jordan here. But Jordan just comes right in under the radar, and he's laying the foundation for saying, hey, wait a minute. We're all pursuing an ideal. And we're all trying to figure out what that ideal is. That's the question you asked. And these ideals are deep beneath the surface. They're built into our imaginations. In fact, they've been built into the ideal in the movie theater where my friend tried to plant a church was deliver a particular experience alone together in a particular way. And everything about the architecture of a movie theater is about that. And church architecture. Now, if you're in a mega church, you're sort of doing that alone together thing, but then you have small groups, and I talked about that with Tripp. But there's so much that Jordan is laying down here. He is planting seeds that when these things germinate, stuff changes.
We don't manifest that ideal, right? Your conscience bothers you. You feel guilty. You feel ashamed because you're not putting forward your ideal self. And that ideal, people have been trying to sort out what that ideal is for a very long time.
Sure.
And back to, so as you haven't forgotten what this video is supposed to be about, because I warned you right at the beginning how this road was going to be. I always say Christianity both seeded our contemporary ideas of marriage equality and resist them, because the ideal is love your neighbor. And how will you love your gay neighbor? Will you deny your gay neighbor the kind of security, companionship, satisfying sexuality that heterosexual people enjoy? How unloving of you. That's a powerful point. We wouldn't be having a conversation about gay marriage without Christianity.
So certainly the Egyptians you talked about, part of their ideal was Isis, Horus, Osiris. They all represented different elements of existence. Osiris was the god of the state, essentially. He was willfully blind and was defeated by his evil brother, Seth. That happens to states all the time, that malevolent forces take them over when they're willfully blind. And Horus
happens to churches too.
Horus is the Egyptian eye. And everyone knows that symbol still, which is quite amazing given that it's thousands of years old. And Horus is the god who pays attention. So the Egyptians worshipped attention as the force that revitalized the old state.
Now, this video was definitely after Pejo's video, but pay attention to attention. And this is a big theme of Peterson's. It's not a theme that gets a lot of attention, but he makes it in his maps of meaning classes.
And it's brilliant. It's different than thought, attention, right?
That's the point he makes often, whether it's maps of meaning or his personality, that thought and attention have an interesting relationship.
Attention is reception. It's being willing to see what's in front of your eyes. Mm-hmm. And so the Egyptians figured out, took them a long, long time.
Being willing to see what's in. It's more than that. It's also desire. It's desiring to see what's in front of your eyes.
That there was something divine about the capacity to pay attention. Something that would redeem the blind state. So,
it's the second time he's had to fight back a yawn.
All of us are inheritors of a cultural tradition. It's functional. In the U.S., that's embodied, I suppose, in the Constitution. But the Constitution is dead, except insofar as it's embodied in living people who are paying attention, right? So the Egyptian pharaoh was a combination of Osiris and Horus. It's a brilliant idea, hey? So that meant that he was the tradition that had founded the state, plus the capacity to pay attention and renew the state. Yeah. And they figured out that was the central idea, the central element of appropriate sovereignty.
Wow.
Right? Because you might say, well, would it be brute force? Would it be power? There's lots of accusations about that today, that cultural institutions are basically predicated on power. That's wrong. It's a terrible way to think. I mean, they are predicated on power when they become corrupt. But, everyone who's corrupt uses power. No one that is behaving according to the ideal uses force to get their way. And it's not very efficient anyways. Makes you unpopular.
Yeah.
It makes you a target. It's unstable socially. It's unsophisticated. Doesn't even work well for children. Doesn't work well for animals, for that matter, often.
So it might not, maybe it's not even that whether the story's right or not, it's maybe.
When you listen to her, what's going on in her mind with respect to this follow-up question, right or wrong? Is the Bible right or wrong? Are these religious stories right or wrong? Because I'm just out there with my holy buzzwords and making stuff up, and vulnerability and authenticity and Ram Dass and I'm a religious consumer out there being my authentic self, choosing my things and taking things that are salient to me and putting them together, and that's how we concoct our religion, especially if we're not deeply embedded in a disciplined religious tradition.
Maybe it's not even that whether the story's right or not, it's maybe more of a guideline. It's more archetypal.
I don't want the American government to have laws. I want them to have guidelines. I want them laws on everybody else, but guidelines for me, please. Thank you.
Archetypal kind of, it's more archetypal kind of.
Oh, she's been listening to Jordan Peterson, hasn't she?
Whether the story's right or not, it's maybe more of a guideline. It's more archetypal kind of stories that help guide us. And maybe it doesn't even matter if they were real. What matters is that we're using them to be better, to have good ideals, to be better person.
Real's a tricky business in some sense, because abstract things can be more real than concrete things. Like numbers, for example, are very abstract, but they're real enough so that if you can manipulate them, you can change the world. And if you read deep literature is in some sense a distillation of character, right? I mean, no one would want to read just about your day if you described every detail.
Right.
You sort of pull out what's interesting and relevant and essential. And so these stories are in some sense essential. And so they're true in that they're abstractions. That's how I look at it. Now, that leaves open the relationship between them and what we would normally consider historical truth. And there's a tremendous amount of debate about that. I certainly don't have the answer to that. But, there's an idea, for example, common idea that Christ is the King of Kings. Well, So you imagine that you abstract out of people what would make someone noble, right? So you look at noble features across across a assortment of different people, and you think, well, I could make a noble character out of that. And then you take all those noble characters, and you take the most noble element of them, and you say, that's a king. Then you take a group of kings, and you say, what's most kingly? You abstract out that. Right. So that's part of the idea. Now, people like Carl Jung and C.S. Lewis believed that.
That was interesting that he paired both of them here.
Now, people like Carl Jung and C.S. Lewis believed that. They believed that Christ acted out that archetype, that King of Kings. And so there was a union between the historical reality and the abstraction. And so, we don't know what would happen if an ideal person came into existence. Perhaps nothing. I mean, we don't know, do we? But
is that maybe not even the point?
Again, I mean, what's this is a master class of what Peterson is doing here, because he is shaking the foundations of her deconstruction. Because the point Tim Keller makes often is that you don't really just deconstruct. What you really do is you piece together a different system. Because a lot of times sort of secularity wants to say, we're going to get rid of all of this religious artifice as if it can be a religion-free zone. And Keller and the Dutch Calvinists and a lot of people basically, it's not really what you're doing. It's just an alternative system. It's not the absence of a system. And so Peterson is pushing back against a lot of these holy buzzwords that she's been using to construct a system, and he's testing them, and she's, this is all very polite and welcoming and all this stuff, but work's being done here.
Really,
do we? But
is that maybe not even the point? I've really thought about this. Is that not the point, maybe even of being here in this human existence? Do we need the polarity? Do we need the sides? Do we need the contrast? Like, if there was an ideal person, does that even work here?
If you believe Jesus is an ideal person, read the Gospels and pay attention to whether or not people liked him. Because that's key. Because deep in this American idea is that when if something really true and really right was in front of it, we would recognize it and love it. Read the prologue to the Gospel of John. The New Testament's very skeptical. And it says, no, we'd probably hate it. Why? Because we love our system. Because it's ours. This goes all the way back to Genesis 3.
That's a good question. I mean, we do seem disappointed when people don't live up to the ideal that we expect. But by the same token, we tend to love people even sometimes for their faults, certainly despite them.
Yeah.
So ideal guides us along and judges us all the time. You work towards a better self, at least to some degree. You have some conceptualization of that. You're excited when that works out and disappointed when it doesn't. Certainly with people you love, although you do accept them in some sense the way they are, you're disappointed when
another yawn.
They aren't all they could be as far as you're concerned. That's particularly true probably of family members. Perhaps that's particularly true of parents in relationship to their children. And that's a funny question. When you love somebody, do you love the ideal they could be, or do you love them? Or both, perhaps. Because you want to encourage them. You want to have them grow towards something that's better.
Mm-hmm. And, we're so attracted to vulnerability. And vulnerability implies perhaps a shortcoming, right? Like something.
So vulnerability thing. I've been watching too much Bachelor, and I really love vulnerability. Do you really? Do you love that in your door lock? I don't think so. Why do you love it? And they go into it. But I wanted to make the point here that I listened to this and it was like, wait a minute. Ideals, attention, what we love, what we desire. And then right away I thought of a different conversation where two people were dealing with these kinds of questions, I think, at a deeper way. And that was the conversation he had with Jonathan Pejo. We aspire to ideals. We don't necessarily consciously embrace ideals. And in fact, it takes us a long time to be able to articulate the ideals that we possess. That they're definitely working beneath the surface. Beneath or above. They're definitely working on us, but we worship ideals. We organize around ideals. I mean, this is the point of the desire is the heart of religion. And it's the individual, it's homo duplex. It's back and forth. The desire for emotional energy is at the heart of religion. Humans seek emotional energy, and this energy is the drug or force that catalyzes sociality. In fact, all of what it takes, and now as a pastor, I know what it takes to establish and maintain a religious institution. And a lot of what we've been seeing in the culture is the collapse of religious institutions, mostly because they are abandoned. And this is a point that I make often with respect to people like to say, well, paganism was suppressed by tyrannical Christian kings. Well, you can certainly find examples of that. But I think the historical record more illustrates that paganism was abandoned. And it was abandoned because people were opting. They desired something else, and they desired the church. Now, again, that's over huge realms of time. But, if you listen to Tom Holland listen to his episode on the Olympics. They gave up on the Olympics. It was abandoned. They didn't bother to organize it anymore. And you say, well, watch what's happening to churches. The same thing is happening now. Churches are abandoned. Look at my conversation about churches in Quebec. They're abandoned. Living Stones is, abandoned in many ways. Now, not by the faithful who community be here, but it's abandoned by the culture. What Living Stones is offering, the community isn't buying. And, part of that's perhaps my fault. But this is the way religions rise and fall. And there are ideals that work deep beneath it, and these ideals can either energize and motivate them, or if the ideal is maintained and there's a disconnection between that and the environment, the things collapse. That's how this stuff works. Churches don't die often because they're suppressed. In fact, often suppression helps motivate it because it's forbidden fruit. Well, if the government is so interested in shutting them up, surely they must be saying something right. I mean, we're all suspicious that way. We play those games. But there are ideals beneath the surface, and we worship those ideals, and we need groups in order to achieve those ideals. Now, the conversation that really got into this was Jordan's conversation with Jonathan. So now look at Jordan in this conversation. This conversation, that's back when they were putting the dates of the conversations on the podcast. They stopped doing that, which is annoying to me because I'm really nosy. How could I not be nosy with a nose this big? But Jordan is much less unwell when he spoke with Jonathan. But hang on.
We were doing that.
Oops, I didn't even had the link wrong. Okay, so here they're talking about this book by a couple of Roman Catholic scholars. Both that book is out now. I haven't read it. I read the sample, the free sample on Amazon. And, when I talked about the Alyssa Childers video, in some ways, maybe I'll read the whole book at some point, but in some ways, that was the impression I got from the book, that, Jordan Peterson is insufficiently Roman Catholic. Duh! I don't need to read a book to know that. He's not Roman Catholic. And I've made, I want to be careful here because I've made plenty of videos. He's insufficiently Christian Reformed. He's not Christian Reformed at all. What's interesting about it? I'm not so much interested in the ways that Jordan Peterson necessarily fails to hit a mark that I have for him. I'm more interested in what he has to say that can help me understand the world better. And those things are usually sort of outside my area of knowledge and expertise. I'm interested in what he knows and what I don't. And a lot of where this goes is this question of ideals.
I would say traumatically positive.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't think that would be possible, really, but I find it that way. Partly it's overwhelming to have people constantly tell me in person their responses to what I've been doing. It's very emotional, and I get caught up in that quite quickly. And of course, on YouTube and the social media platforms, YouTube particularly, the bulk of the comments about me are very, very positive. It's 99-1 often in terms of likes and dislikes. And it's too much. Well, I don't know what category to put it in. I don't know how to conceptualize it. Part of me, the practical part, of course, says, well, I just happened to adopt a new technology at a time when it started to boom. and filled a kind of niche that was empty in that technology at that time. But in some sense, that doesn't really cut it, because it doesn't have anything to do with the content. And then I think, well, I have been dealing with these, borderline religious issues. Well, certainly not just borderline. There's lots of religious people who seem to think that I'm dealing with religious issues. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about tonight. So this book I mentioned earlier talked about disagreements with my conceptualization of Christ, let's say, and I'm not sure what that conceptualization is, by the way, exactly. It's a mystery to me, but I can say some concrete things about it.
And that's not a small point. And that point is beneath a lot of these points, that these conceptualizations are acting within us, among us, around us, above us. Again, back to my conversation with JP and John Vervaeke about spirits. We don't know. So let's fess up to it. But we want to know because we know it's important. And so we explore. And that's what he's doing here with his friend, between friends.
I mean, I certainly, I understand and appreciate the symbolic significance of the ideal human being. And that finds its embodiment. And I took these ideas in large part from Jung and Erich Neumann. That Christ is at least a representation of the ideal man, whatever that is. And we all, interestingly enough, we all seem to have an ideal. And that ideal has us.
And that's a huge point. We all have an ideal, or that ideal has us.
Us. Right? And that's where it's very interesting to consider the role of conscience. Because your conscience will call you out on your behavior. And so it seems to function as something that's somewhat independent, or at least as something that you can't fully voluntarily control. Because if you could voluntarily control it, then you just tell the pesky little bastard to go away, or to pat you on the back continually. Because there must be few things in life more pleasurable than being a fully committed narcissist. To really believe that everything that you do is right and that you're a good person. And I suppose if you could wave a magic wand and rearrange your mind so that it was constantly telling you that, you'd do it. But you don't seem to be able to do that in relationship to your conscience. It trips you up. And so it tells you when you're not living up to your own ideal. And that means that you have an ideal and you don't even know what the hell it is, but you certainly know when you transgress against it. And I know that there's a strong line of Christian thinking that's identified the conscience with divinity, sometimes with Christ inside, sometimes with the Holy Spirit. And
there are a lot more people that do it, I'll say naively and not in a pejorative way, but they do it. That's that little voice that they listen to. And people inside and outside the church. And as a pastor, I talk to regular people about their spiritual and religious experiences, and they tell me these things. And I, over the years, I've learned to keep my mouth shut and not correct them and just listen and learn. That doesn't mean I don't have thoughts on it, but if you're the kind of pastor that keeps trying to clean up and correct everybody's theological language, people shut up and only tell you what they think you want to hear. And that's usually boring. So I'm much more interested in listening to what they really think.
Those are very interesting conceptualizations, but you can think of them psychologically, and you can even think about them biologically, to some degree, because we're so social. If we don't...
Again, back to Durkheim, homo duplex.
Manifest an appropriate moral reciprocity, we're going to become alienated from our fellows, and we won't survive, and we'll suffer and die, and we certainly won't find a partner and have children successfully. And so
now, right there, and we're going to talk about MF4L, as it's kind of been reduced to in my video. Male, female, for life, as an archetypal, ideal structure. No other combination achieves what that one does. It's an ideal. And we're going to talk about that. But ideals are powerful, and it's an archetypal ideal. You can't get around it. And we'll work through that, Math.
To some degree, the conscience can be viewed as the voice of reciprocal society within, and that's a perfectly reasonable biological explanation. But the thing is the deeper you go into biology, the more it shades into something that appears to be religious, because you start analyzing the fundamental structure of the psyche itself, and it becomes something. Well, it becomes something with a power that transcends your ability to resist it. So you can think about Christ from a psychological perspective, and my critic, this particular critic that I've been reading, said, well, that doesn't differentiate Christ much from a whole sequence of dying and resurrecting mythological gods. And of course, people have made that claim in comparative religion. Joseph Campbell did that, and Jung to a lesser degree, I would say, but Campbell did that. But the difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a representation of, there's a historical representation of his existence as well.
So again, now there's a little bit of anachronism going on here, because in our culture, at this point, Danica Patrick and Aaron Rodgers included, whether they know it or not, there's a Christological ideal within the culture built into all sorts of things that Christians may or may not agree with, like loving your gay neighbor and saying, I'm going to wave the rainbow flag because marriage is happiness. We're going to talk about what marriage is in our culture. And it's unfair to exclude you because of some innate orientation that you have. That's, in a sense, Christ manifesting in an expression of, let's call it marriage equality. That's built in, but it's built in a lot of different things. And people might say, no, thank you to the Bible and Jesus and the gospel. But all that stuff is deeply within. And that's, and a lot of that is the point of Tom Holland and what he's convinced me of in terms of his writing and his podcast and all of that stuff. So all that stuff is functioning. So Christ is the ideal man, even for people who would say it isn't. And he isn't. We say, well, Jesus and Buddha and Gandhi and Ram Dass and yeah, but it's just us talking, and Christ is so deep in there that something grabbed us, a desire for Christ in a way that has grabbed the civilization, and so we want to have it manifest, and so some want to have it manifest in rainbow flags and marriage equality. And I'm not a skeptic of that's at work in there. But, again, we're going to get to the argument. We're not ready for it yet.
Now, you can debate whether or not that's genuine. You can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that, but it doesn't matter.
Okay, and then you get into the question of truth as physical congruence or physical mapping. That's always this question that we have. And so he and Danica Patrick were, just on that briefly, but physical correspondence issues of historicity. And there's real reasons in history. I mean, again, a lot of the Roman Catholics and Orthodox are like, modernity could have done without it. No, I don't think so. I think Protestantism was inevitable. I think modernity is inevitable as downstream from Christianity. I don't think you get to it from the other places. Not that Christianity has a lock on physical correspondentism in terms of an idea of truth, but that was, basically what the Enlightenment was to try to do is wring out corruption. Now, part of the problem with almost every anti-corruption effort is because we're low resolution, blunt force creatures, and we break a lot of other things when we're trying to get rid of corruption. So that's important, and those questions are important. But as Peterson is onto here, let those questions have their day. But in terms of how human beings live and work, you can't stop at those questions. If you just stop at those questions, you're going to have other corruptions. You're going to be playing other tricks on yourself, because you need this deeper level. You need to get into and to get down deep inside or far up above and figure what exactly is moving the fields of corn in Iowa.
In some sense, because it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter, because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief, and I don't understand it. Because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. That's Jungian synchronicity. Yeah. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. We have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. We treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. It's partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
If you believed in the story of Christ, or if you believed that history and let's say the narrative meet,
both, I think you, because when you believe that, you buy both those stories. You believe that the narrative and the objective can actually touch.
Yeah.
We saw that, you and I mean, this is a trivial example, but when we were discussing, we had a sequence of discussions around frog symbolism 4 years ago.
Yeah.
That was very bizarre, to say the least. And that was a relatively trivial example of the narrative world and the objective world coming together. Didn't feel that trivial at the time.
Well, the way that I like to deal with this is that one of the things, it's already there in your thought. It's already there in the way that you talk about reality, which is that one of the constitutive aspects of how reality unfolds and how it appears to us is something like attention, right? It's something, there's a hierarchy of manifestation, because everything.
Remember in the Danica, Patrick, the talk about attention, it's a big theme of Peterson. Now, Pejo is reminding Peterson, attention is not thought. Attention is different. It's, in some ways, attention is a manifestation of desire.
Thing that appears to us in the world has an infinite amount of details, right? It has an indefinite amount of ways that you could describe it, angles by which you could analyze it. And so, nonetheless, the world appears to us through these hierarchies of meaning, right? I always kind of use the example of a cup or a chair. Like a chair is just a multitude of things. It's a multitude of parts. How is it that we can say that it's one thing? There's a capacity we have to attend, and this capacity we have to attend is something like a co-creation of the world. And so the world actually exists.
Well, a chair is a good example, because you can try to define it objectively, but you end up with beanbags and stumps, and
exactly,
and they don't have anything in common. Well, they're both made of matter, for whatever that's worth. It's pretty trivial level of commonality, but you can sit on them.
Yeah,
and that's what unites them.
There's a mode of being which defines them.
Well, and that's so strange. So many of our object perceptions are projected modes of being. And so even the objective world is ineluctably contaminated with its utility, and therefore with morality.
Exactly. And so I think that that's the key. The key is that once you understand that the world manifests itself through attention, and that consciousness has a place to play in actually the way in which the world reveals itself. And so you can try to posit a world outside of that first person perspective, but it's kind of diluted. It's a diluted activity.
Well, it's very, very difficult, because you don't know what to make of something like time, because time has an ineradicably subjective element, and duration, which is different than time. I mean, time is kind of like the average rate at which things change, but duration is something like the felt sense of that time. And if you take away the subjectivity, it isn't obvious what to do with time. And I think physicists stumble over this all the time, so to speak. So, and this is something that this intermingling of value and fact was something that I never thought I made much traction with Harris, with Sam Harris. He didn't seem to me to be willing to admit how saturated the world of fact is.
Not willing to admit or couldn't see?
Inevitably with value. And I actually think he's denying the science at that point, because for everything I know about perceptual psychology, there's a great book called Vision as a... Oh, God, now I can't remember the name of the books. That's memory trouble. I'll remember it.
No worries. The idea is that if that is true, then there are certain things which come out of that. There are certain necessary things down the road from that insight, which is that attention plays a part in the way the world lays itself out. And that one of them is that the stuff that the world is made of is partly something like attention, something like consciousness, and that has a pattern. And that pattern is the same pattern as stories. It doesn't lay itself out exactly the same, but things exist.
Can you see where this goes back to the Danica Patrick video in terms of story, attention?
With a pattern which is similar to stories. They have identities, they have centers, they have margins, they have exceptions. And that's how stories lay themselves out. Like, so a story happens in time, how an identity, let's say, is broken down and then reconstructed. You could say that that's basically the story of every story, how something breaks down and is reconstructed. And so that is a way for us to perceive the identity of things. And so if the world is made of this, then it's actually our world, our secular world, which is a strange aberration on how reality used to exist for every culture in every time from the beginning of time, which is to take that for granted, that something that they didn't call it consciousness, but intelligence and attention are part of how the world lays itself out. And it lays itself out in modes of being. And one of the things that comes out of it is not only that, but like you said, it's not only that you have ideas, but it's that ideas have you, or that it's not only that you engage in modes of being, it's that modes of being have you. And that recognition means that the first level of attention to that looks something like worship. It looks like celebration. It looks like the thing which makes...
Now, again, we're going to worship, and we're talking about Protestant churches here, and we're talking about it in the context of Wellman's High on God book, because we're talking about motivation for worship. And so worship happens, and when we're conscious of it happening, and when we're conscious of its value, we seek to do it. But again, to do it alone is one thing. To do it with others, and this is a big part of Wellman's book, is so much better. And so mega churches have, in a lot of ways, perfected the psychotechnology of this. But let's be fair to Roman Catholics and to Orthodox. They're using other psychotechnologies, and so the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics with their cathedrals and their pageantry. I mean, it's all psychotechnology that they're using in order to focus on worship and to do this thing, together. By myself, yes, but together is better. And so this is the homo duplex, and it's all coming together. And what's happening when we're doing this is not only are we having imprinted in us these ideals down deep beneath us, but we are also developing a longing, a desire to live out those values. That's what we're doing in church. This is why politicians, if there's a religious movement that is counter to a political aim, doesn't like those churches, don't like those churches. And that's why you get a lot of carping about evangelical churches, even though, according to many studies, the American people who identify as Christians in the United States are sort of split right down the middle between the two parties. Although that everything's changing now with the rise of the unaffiliated and people who feel homeless because of one party or another. But the evangelical church has had a fairly tight lock on certain aspects of this, and so there's a lot of political hand-wringing about it. But these ideas come together in this, and we need groups in order to achieve these ideals, and we long to worship with each other, and this is why Jordan and Jonathan are friends, and Jonathan longs for Jordan to join him in worship. Now, they don't live in the same town, and I don't know what church Jonathan goes to, but they want good things for each other. And that's actually the basis of every conversation, because we have something that we think is true and good and beautiful, and so we want to share it with someone else so that they enjoy it too. And it's all of the working on all of these ideals together.
Let's say the National Hockey League so successful has more to do with celebration than just a bunch of guys on skates on a piece of ice, throwing a puck around. There's a celebration of the purpose of that thing, and it manifests itself through a bunch of stuff, one is like a trophy that stands in the middle on the top of on a stand, and everybody looks at it and kisses it. And so there's this veneration, and there's mascots.
The Hockey League example is very interesting because it's a social game, and all the players they're attempting to aim right.
Now, if you didn't listen to my conversation with Vervaeke and JP, we got into some of this stuff there, and I really enjoyed that conversation.
Right, so there's a symbolic element to that. Sin is misplaced aim,
yep.
And so right. you hit the small space in the net, blocked though it may be by your enemies, and everyone celebrates that, and you do that in cooperation with other people and in competition with other people. And if you do it properly, not only are you a brilliant player from a technical perspective, but you're also a great sport. And so there's an ethic there and a morality. And this is why people are so upset when hockey players or any other pro athlete does something immoral in their personal life, is because it violates the ethic that's being celebrated as a consequence of this great game.
Okay, right there. That is that point. Why should anyone care in church if the pastor is sleeping around? It's the same point as the hockey player. It's the same point as our interest in Aaron Rodgers or Danica Patrick. It's the same point that these games are not just mere games. In our hearts and our ideals and our imaginary, they fan out, and they're enormous. And so churches that want to say things like, well, we're not going to police sexuality, I have yet to see that. And we're going to talk a little bit later about, we don't really mean that. We're not acting like we really believe that, because enforcing clergy sexuality has become an obsession in our culture, in the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, and people who are quickly ready to deconstruct point at pedophile priests and Ravi Zachariah and Bill Hybels. And one of the things that this podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, has not pointed out is that, hey, for all of Mark Driscoll's failures, he hasn't slept around, to our knowledge. That's not an unimportant point in that whole conversation, because there's an ideal at work deep beneath it that is working in the church, and that gives desire and energy and motivation for people to tithe and to give their time and to give their offerings and to most of all give their attention to the church. And as Jordan and Jonathan said here, we see that in hockey. We watch the love lives of celebrities. And so, of course, I hadn't. So, again, before this video, it's like I don't want to say anything wrong. So I had to quickly Google, are Aaron Rodgers and Danica Patrick still together? And actually, there's conflicting stories out there, but it seems like no. And that no is not incidental in terms of marriage and ideal and everything that's in play. Because all of this stuff is working on us beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And right, so you can see that the striving for an ideal mode of being, the religious striving for an ideal mode of being is central to what it is that makes hockey addictive.
That's right. Yeah, necessarily. And so
God,
one
I saw
of the
that
things,
in pro wrestling. There's a great documentary.
He said this. You can find this documentary on YouTube, by the way, and I just started watching it. And he's right, because early in the documentary, not to give too much away, Hitman Hart was part of the WWE, and I think it's Vince McMahon, Trump's friend who was running this whole thing, wanted him to basically take a fall. And Hitman Hart's like, I can't do that. That's to betray my character and betray my fans. And Vince McMahon is like, hey, wait a minute. We propped you up because you're good looking and you're fulfilling these archetypes and you're doing this narrative. And we all know, what's that word that Eric Weinstein has? You'll put it in the comments. We all know this is a drama here that we're doing. He says, yeah, but I'm not going to let you dictate my character. I said, wait a minute, I'm the author of this story. WWE is what I invented. I am the author. You are the actor. Act according to the script. I quit. So off he goes into something else. I haven't finished watching the thing. In fact, I'm only just started. But this is the point that Peterson is making here.
Bret Hart, called Hitman Hart. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. And it portrays pro wrestling as a stark religious battle between the forces of good and evil. And Bret Hart, who at one point was the most famous Canadian in the world, was overwhelmed by the archetypal force of his representation as the good guy.
Is Jordan Peterson now the most famous Canadian in the world? Could be.
It's a great documentary, Hitman Hart. And it shows you how pro wrestling is it's not the world's most intellectual activity, to say the least, and people can easily be dismissive of it. But one of the things I loved about the documentary was that it attempted to understand from within what was compelling about what was being portrayed. And it was a religious drama. It was shocking and brilliant.
And so that is actually, there's an objective part of that there's an objective way in which these patterns kind of come together and manifest, let's say, higher and higher versions of this drama. And so the sports drama has a certain level, but it's limited to a certain extent because it still happens as a confrontation, let's say, between two irreducible sides. And so what happens in something like the story of Christ is that gets taken into one person. And so all the opposites become the king and the criminal.
Now where he's going, and so I just made the case, and I can make it well, because part of how not to straw man is I can make an excellent case for marriage equality in the church. I don't think it's a hard case to make. I think for many people it's a very obvious case to make, and they're very angry and offended that churches and conservative people are resisting them. And so they come up with all kinds of, they're resisting them because of ignorance, because they've never met a gay person, because the Bible is an Iron Age mythology and it should all be laid to rest, and we should only read the poetic parts of it that we agree with, and we should just push aside the other parts because everybody really does pick and choose, and on and on and on. I can make these cases all day long. But one of the things that Christianity does is deal with, and as Pejo says, deals with both equality and hierarchy. And Christ somehow manages to change these things.
Criminal become the king, and the criminal, the highest, even in the image of the cross, you have this image. And as Christ is being crucified, they're putting a sign above his head saying that he's the king. As Christ is being beaten, they're giving to him a crown. And so Christ joins together all the opposites. And so in his story, you see, if you're attentive to these patterns, you see the highest form of this pattern being played out. And one of the aspects that has to be there for it to be the most revealed or highest form is that it also has to include the world of manifestation. I mean, it can't just be a story. It has to be connected to the world. So that's why Christians insist on the fact that Jesus is not just a story, that he's an incarnated man, that he was incarnated.
But I don't.
And we do that because, see, marriage is a beautiful story. The fairy tale marriage, we have all of that. But we want to participate in it. And that means what we do is we want to instantiate it. We want to make it real. Hockey players in their mind have the idea of what it means to, I don't know hockey. I'll use the NFL season is starting. I'll use Aaron Rodgers. A quarterback has it in his mind, and they talk about, I'm going to manifest this. I'm going to visualize this. And Aaron Rodgers in his training is, they work on the footwork and to put, it's amazing what they do with a football, what Aaron Rodgers does with a football. It's absolutely astounding. But they do it in their mind, and in their mind, they long to have it manifest in their body and in reality. That is a central part of this. And to say, well, it's a nice story, but always only a story. You have that even in the Lord of the Rings movies where, they want, Elrond wants Arwen to go off, with the elves. And no, she wants to stay with Aragorn. And no, go off where your love will be undying, with you immortal. But no, my love will always be only a dream. I want it to take on flesh because that is so powerful. And that drives us. People have a vision. I have a vision for a business, and the business will never be what your vision is, but you long to have it manifest. That's desire. And what we do when we worship is we attempt to manifest all of this stuff in our lives. And so what is true in the temple becomes true in the streets because that's what we desire. And that's exactly what they're talking about here.
I don't believe their insistence. I don't believe
that he was incarnated.
But I don't believe their insistence. I don't believe that, well, this is because it isn't obvious to me, and I think maybe I derived this criticism from Nietzsche, but people have asked me whether or not I believe in God, and I've answered in various ways. No, but I'm afraid he probably exists. That's one answer. No, but I'm terrified he might exist. That would be a truthful answer to some degree, or that I act as if God exists, which I think is, I do my best to do that. But then there's a real stumbling block there because
even the acting as if he exists is a desire to manifest the reality of the story out into the world. Isn't that what telling the truth is? Isn't that what morality is?
There's no limit to what would happen if you acted like God existed.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I believe that acting that out fully, maybe it's not reasonable to say to believers, you aren't sufficiently transformed for me to believe that you believe in God.
It's very reasonable to say. And as a pastor of a church, I can say that about the people in my church, and they can say it about me.
Or that you believe the story that you're telling me. You're not a sufficient, the way you live isn't sufficient testament to the truth.
And this is going to come into play in terms of this ideal, because no marriage equals the ideal. But what we desire, what we long for, is to attain as high as we can, as close to the ideal. That is what we want. That is what our hearts desire, and we will sacrifice. The pursuit of that is deeply meaningful, if it's not, in fact, meaning itself.
And people would certainly say that, let's say, about the Catholic Church, or at least the way that it's been portrayed, is that with all the sexual corruption, for example, it's like, really, you...
Why the sexual aspect of it? Because the Roman Catholic Church fails in many, many other ways dramatically. But there's something about the sexual aspect of it that just, it's one of these nexus points in human reality that it's all right down to it.
You believe that the Son of God, that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and yet you act that way, and I'm supposed to buy your belief. And it seems to me that the church is actually quite guilty on that account, because the attempts to clean up the mess have been rather half-hearted in my estimation.
Yeah.
And so I don't think Christians don't manifest this, and I'm including myself.
Now pay attention to that, because a little bit later we're going to talk about purity complexes and purity cultures, and the attempts to clean up the mess have been half-hearted. Oh my, our attempts to clean up, our attempts to channel sexuality. Oh.
I suppose in that description, perhaps don't manifest the transformation of attitude that would enables the outside observer to easily conclude that they believe.
Yeah. Now the way to deal with that, or the way to understand that, is that they do in a hierarchy. There's a hierarchy of manifestation of the transformation that God offers the world, and we kind of live in that hierarchy, and those above us hold us together, you would say. And so in the church there's a testimony of the saints. I
was very interested yesterday in JP's bringing in the saints into that conversation. It's very interesting.
Stories. There are hundreds.
But the saints make the point here, because you point to a saint and say, see, it can happen. Now you have this all around. You look at the list of Stanley Cup winners and you say, see, it can happen. You look at stockholder portfolios, you look at Apple Corporation and Steve Jobs, and you say, see, it can happen. And what that does is motivates people to say, if it can happen to Steve Jobs, if it can happen to, I'm going to use NFL, Jerry Rice, or Major League Baseball, Babe Ruth, or Hank Aaron, it can happen to me. And that's deep. That's desire in us, and it's homo duplex. It's alone together, and we're swimming in this. Now, I think I've made my point with this video, and this video is already going to be very long, so I'll keep going. Now we're going to get to some of the point that some of you have wanted all along. Traditional marriage is a powerful archetypal ideal. And it's not just an ideal, because there are many ideals. Everybody has ideals. I say it's an archetypal ideal because, again, you get Jordan Peterson talking about archetypes, and he says, well, archetypes are things that you can't get around. Now, the best argument for full inclusion, which is, so when you get down to, like, say, Christian Reformed church politics about what to do with specific synodical committees and votes at synod and assemblies, we're having a deliberative assembly, so state your case. Tell us what you want. And what All One Body wants to do is, number one, defeat the Human Sexuality Report, and number two, use what I call their burning down the house strategy to sort of wear the institution down to no longer fight this fight, or have people willing to fight to abandon it, to go to separate holes. And so I pay very close attention to their language, and the best they can usually do are things like full inclusion or marriage equality, words like that. And so it's, okay, well, tell me what that means, because full means full. Because what everybody knows is that sort of the common trick right now is you take a desire, and you take the desire and you call it an identity, and then you leverage all of the civil rights things to demand equal access for that particular identity. Black is identity, woman is identity, gay is identity, lobster eaters can be an identity. So full inclusion of lobster eaters, and right away, hey, full is full, and we're going to look at this purity dynamic. So the best argument for full inclusion is mercy and vision or equality. So, and again, Christianity does enormous things with equality and hierarchy, and Pejo talks about that quite well. But Christianity isn't just equality, it's also hierarchy. And we really struggle to figure out that language. Now, this is not taken seriously by the marriage equality vision, because I think, in fact, traditional marriage is archetypal. I think it's something you can't get around. It's an ideal. One man, one woman for life. That's the basic formula, or MF4L. Male, male, and female, female is less than male, female. Why? Because there's no potential for reproduction. They're the same. And Tim Keller talks about, I like the part Tim Keller talks about, there's difference built in. Two men are, in some aspects, more than one man. But a man and a woman are, because of a myriad of differences between male and female, including the reproductive aspect. The combination of the combination of men and women has a power differential, which is way more powerful than two men or two women. Now, okay, biology and reproductive science and adoption and yeah. But no, it's not the same. There's an archetypal ideal with one man, one woman. That is, the others are limited compared to it. And one of the things that in our modern period we have, especially with anxieties about overpopulation, technology about the pill, we insufficiently realize the power of human reproduction. And if you want to look at that, read Ross Douthat's book on decadence. Take a look at why there's enormous migration from Africa to Europe, why Muslim immigration from Africa to Europe is changing the face of Europe. Human reproduction determines the future. I was walking with some young progressive women, and they were joking about the very few classmates they have that are already married and reproducing children. Ha 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 ha. And they noticed that all of these are Republicans. And I said, aren't they giving birth to young Republicans? Who's going to win elections 20 years from now? Time. We're going to talk about time and this. So one man, one woman for life is an archetypal ideal. You can't get around it. Two men? No. Two women? No. Three people? No. One man, one woman for life. Well, what about as long as this works for me? No, that's less ideal than for life. Watch any amount of The Bachelor, Bachelorette, Bachelor in Paradise, any of that. I want my person for life. That's the ideal. They strive for it. They long for it. They desire it. They sacrifice for it. Now, they don't attain the ideal, and that's what an ideal is. An ideal is something that we sacrifice in order to achieve. And we want to do so, generally speaking, for many great human sacrifices, for many visions we wish to achieve, we need communal sacrifice and communal participation. And in fact, that's why we group up, in order to achieve what we as individuals cannot achieve. In our culture, marriage has become in our culture an expression of emotional romantic ideal, which is less than this full-bodied, incarnate, reproductive, scalable in both directions. Because you might say, well, lots of male, male, female, population decline. How does that relate to society? It's complex. Again, read Ross Douthat's book on decadence. There's a lot going on here that we don't understand. But the romantic, emotional ideal, it's too ascetic. Because anybody who's been married will tell you, yeah, you have peaks and valleys on that score. But why do you stay together? Because there are other ideals, and lots of other ideals come nested in. We stay together for the kids. Why? Because you have an ideal for them. And it's participating. So in fact, this one ideal is deeply tied to lots of other ideals. And if you think through these things, they don't work. There's a lot of what's going on where it's sort of what affluence can afford. If 90% of your population is more or less stable, male, female, commitment for life, maybe you can have a little fringe of 10% other marriages. If most of your marriages are together enough so that the community stays together, you can have some wobbly marriages. But if none of your marriages are stable, you're not going to have whole bunches of other things go well in your community. And we sort of have a knowledge of this, but it's sort of a principle of affluence, in that if you've got a lot of strength in certain things, you can afford wobbliness and fringeness in other areas. It's sort of a extrapolation on Pejo's idea of center and fringe. Now, Protestantism altered the medieval and ancient holy common matrix, and this is where we get into Charles Taylor's one speed, two speed. And he talks about, and I don't know that, a lot of people pushed back on this, and, I read Reformation's book, and I don't know if I agree anymore with Taylor's idea about one speed versus two speed. I think actually some of the speeds went implicit. Now think about some of these things. There's enormous stuff happening around the time of Luther. Remember, Luther's generation is the first generation to live after the Columbian Exchange, as Charles Mann calls it in 1492, his book 1493. And there's enormous changes in late medieval Europe that are destabilizing the old stable ways of the church. And there's a lot of corruption that has to be wrung out, and that ringing that starts in the Reformation will continue in the Enlightenment. That there's the social dynamic between the monastery and the village towards urbanization. And one of the things that Martin Luther, he's a monk. They destroy the monasteries. And the monasteries are abandoned. It's interesting. If you read, I think it's in Fatal Discord, Luther and a couple of his pals are the only ones left in the monastery. It's abandoned. Remember earlier I talked about how religions die? They're abandoned. The monasteries are abandoned. And there's a special relationship between the king, the prophets, and the priest. Again, this goes all the way back to the Hebrew prophets and the Hebrew scriptures. But monarchies, pre-modern monarchies, are different from modern monarchies because, what podcast did I hear? Was it in The Rest of History? Because basically what modernity and urbanization and an emerging economics afforded was a far more powerful nation state, and the old forms of monarchy could no longer compete. You couldn't just, you see this in shows like The Last Kingdom. You just can't mobilize the peasants and give them pitchforks. You need a professional army. You need a navy. You need to figure out, medieval kingdoms couldn't muster what they could muster. And you can get into Rome, and Rome was a different thing. But again, this stuff is terribly integrated. So what happens in Protestantism? Now, this world is being disrupted, and Protestantism is in some ways a fairly early adaptation of this. And of course, then takes on flesh and contributes to increasing adaptation, because for the most part, you had Roman Catholic Spain and the patchwork of Italian city-states. But once England and France and Germany, now you've got Roman Catholic France, but France is different. But once those things come online, the peculiar blend of Anglicanism and the British Empire will eventually rule the waves. And France, France tries to go toe to toe with England, but she can't really. And of course, Napoleon, there's an insurgence, but that's modernity. Excuse me. And you're setting up the French Revolution by the ways that France resists Reformation. And the Roman Catholic Church does Reformation in the Council of Trent, and that's how it modernizes. And you can see mappings between, the kind of Reformation that the Roman Catholic Church did in Trent, getting rid of a lot of the medievalisms in order to combat and counter the rise of Protestantism. And so you have the rise of the nation state in Protestant lands, and the nation state in some ways begins to replace Christendom. And the king increasingly is the head of the church, Henry VIII. And even in the Holy Roman Empire, the prince of the region decides the religion of the region. And of course, all of this is going to continue to develop. And then when we get to the United States, we'll have this idea of religious freedom. But there's deep commonalities beneath secularism that only now we're beginning to notice that, no, secularism is deeply Christian. And if you lose some of those foundations, you lose the glue that's holding the society together, that the glue was actually always religious. And a whole bunch of these implicit ideal agreements around certain ideals were what actually held it together. And in many ways, in Protestantism, the rise of the nuclear family replaces the monastery. And so you actually have all these different speeds. And so that's where you have in Protestant churches, well, the clergy's family is supposed to be the model of the member's family. And this is where, both the catastrophe of the Roman Catholic pedophile issues and the catastrophes of clergy stepping out on their wives is deeply disruptive to their churches. Because beneath there are ideals that the clergy is intended to embody. And I've noticed that throughout my ministry in the Protestant church. I will give people the official line that I am just like you, except I have different gifts. They never believe me. No, Pastor, you need to be more holy. You need to be the ideal of who and what a Christian is. And that's built in far beyond the church. And so when Ravi Zachariah, who doesn't even have a church, or Bill Hybels, when there are sexual indiscretions that happen to them, it ripples through the church. And the pedophile priest thing ripples through Jordan Peterson's imagination. It's like, there's stuff happening under the surface here that's foundational, more than we know, and we can't quite explain it. Now, part of my challenge in my online conversations with marriage equality advocates in the Christian Reformed churches say, okay, I know the old line, male, female for life. That's a durable line. It was sort of like a seawall. And now it was aspirational. Everybody fails it at one point or another, or most fail it, or depends on your level of analysis and to what degree you're allowing the ideal to pan out. Tell me the new line. And so churches will say something like, well, we're going to take the male-female out of it. 2 people for life. But the problem is that these advocates are banking on looking at what's happening in society and letting those deeply religious movements underneath compel the other people in the church to maybe flip on this. And it's all gone. If you only had lesbian and gays, maybe you could make the case. And 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when Born That Way was still in its preeminence, and just read Andrew Sullivan, who, Andrew Sullivan understands very well how his attempt, he played an integral part in marriage equality being adopted by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so when he watches what's happening with the BTQ, he's terrified because he knows that the foundations are being eroded, that 2 people for life isn't the standard. You can't build your line on it now. It's not going to hold. Everybody knows that. You can see that. We have a sense of it. So then I say, well, where is your line? And I would say your line is actually the society's line right now, which is consenting adults. And this is where we get into the fact that in many ways Protestantism, increasingly, if we think of it as 2-speed, the church is 1 speed and society is the other. And we've seen that dynamic because actually there are way more speeds. We've seen that dynamic during the Cold War. Because basically when there was huge alignment between the morality in the mainline church and the morality in general America, church people were basically an intensification of the moral ideals. And maybe, they thought they were prigs, or they thought to be too intense and impractical. But because of that alignment, church was an intensification, just like the monks were an intensification of the secular clergy or the people who are regular churchgoers. And then there, of course, were the other speed of, in Christendom, people who lived in a Catholic nation, and they had to a little degree, mostly just more folk religion, had a little degree some of the ideas of the bigger picture. But you had all these stratas, and at the top were the monks, and at the top of those you had the saints. What Pejo was laying out. So you had this hierarchy. And so during the Cold War, to be a good American, well, you could be to go to synagogue, or you go to church, and there's all this alignment. And that's over. Now the church is trying to sort it out. Some churches will say, we're in alignment. June is Liberation Month, and we have the flags to prove it. We're trying to be in alignment, but the country isn't in alignment. And the others are saying, no, we're not in alignment. We're not giving up our ideal. Well, which ideal? Well, the Bible. Oh, okay. Well, natural law. Oh, okay. My argument is, no, there are ideals and there are structures to these ideals. Now you might say, well, that sounds like a natural law argument. I'm not making it such. Some of you will go with it how you will. Now we're saying consenting adults, but that's looking really thin. Read Ross Douthat's piece on Can the Left Regulate Sex? That's consenting adults as a ship has got a lot of leaks in it. Part of the reason because consent doesn't manage time like covenant. I say yes to now, but tomorrow will I regret it? Covenant says, I'm going to make a commitment now, and as much as I possibly can, I'm going to try to keep it. Now, again, we're aspiring to arise and achieve and to manifest an ideal. And they all fall short in the age of decay. But covenant deals with time in a way consent never can. Then you have all these, well, was there consent? And then the question, well, alcohol, age, can they consent? Is their consent conditioned by power dynamics? Consent isn't going to help you that much. And I'm not saying consent is unimportant, because it's basically the definition between rape, and I'm not advocating that. But consent currently is a weak reed, and to borrow from the Hebrew prophets, if you lean on that reed cane, it will break. Covenant is much stronger, but that's built into male-female for life. Sexual gratification is increasingly imagined as a human right. At some point, depriving children of a right will feel unequal. And I don't think it sounds so crazy to be afraid of this. And this isn't true or stable. Sexual gratification can never be a right. It's actually an achievement. And achievements and rights are two wholly different things. And this gets again back into the question of Protestantism and the state, because, well, if it's a right, well, now the state sort of as the new default church in secular Christendom has to deliver. State prostitutes? We're not that far from the temple of Aphrodite. See, these things don't go away. And what we've got going on right now are contradictory loosenings and tightenings. Well, we need sexual liberation. Well, so let's take a look at Governor Cuomo at the end of his grope. That's a New York Post. So Cuomo was working the new alpha male sexuality. Don't marry, you idiot. Because your gratification, well, yeah, there are nice things to develop in a relationship, but at some point the relationship gets old or your partner gets old, and if you're a high status male with a good head of hair, you can get some. There's a rule, just don't look for some at work. Well, is that a rule? Well, we're going to have to make a law. The New Puritans, there's an interesting series of conversations going on around, can professors and students sleep together? And that's a difficult one because a lot of professors are married to former students. And there's a lot of debate. You can find some of those links on my blog, leadingchurch.com. There's a lot of debates about that going on right now. Power differential. And so again, with the old schema, the question's really simple. Okay, I want to sleep with this person. Is this person my spouse? If the answer is yes, bring some roses home. Take the person out. Wear something attractive. Ask. Suggest. Maybe it's Friday night. You guys know how, if you're married, you know how this goes. If the answer is no, no. And again, the alignment, at least in modernity, between church and state was about the same. Church and state were on the same page. Now the state has moved on. What's the church going to do? That's the real question in the CRC. Is the CRC going to basically default to the legal standard, which again, in Speeds, is sort of watered down, weakening Christendom. Secularity as Christianity light. Now, part of why this is, as I mentioned before, such a fever pitch in the Christian Reformed Church is this a confessional issue? And I think rightly, now whether or not you agree with women in office in terms of the Reformed confession that we have, rightly, the decision was made in the 70s that the women in office question wasn't really a confessional issue. It doesn't mean that's the only thing to be said about the issue. And then now the fierce debate is when clergy sign, and office bearers, that's elders and deacons too, sign the form of subscription, are they signing on to an embrace of traditional marriage? And so what you have in these split-off denominations that's becoming a confessional issue. So when you look at the Alliance of Reformed Churches that I'll talk about in a minute, if you look at the ECHO, the split-off of the PCUSA, Evangelical Presbyterian Church in America, there are new confessions being written about this issue. And the debate in the Christian Reformed Churches is this a confessional issue? And you can find videos by people I know a little bit, some are in Voices, who are saying it's not a confessional issue. And they know that for years now I've been arguing that the Christian Reformed Church needs a lot more serious confessional conversation. We're having it, whether or not we're calling it that, we're having it. Because in the Christian Reformed Church, I'm a synodical deputy, and I regularly are at classis meetings, my own classis or other classis meetings, where church discipline matters come about. And I'll tell you something, in the Christian Reformed Church, about the only people that actually get formally disciplined are clergy, and employees get fired. And the most common reason is sexual misconduct. So Governor Cuomo figures out, hey, marriage is for idiots. You're better off playing the field. So for a while, there was the first girlfriend of the state of New York, and then that broke up. And so then he's looking for another. And, well, if you've been around politics, you know that in many ways in the United States, state and federal politics, they don't pay much. And so they're kind of a starter position for a lot of young people. And some of my kids have been in that shoe. So if you go into state offices like here in Sacramento, there's a lot of young women and a lot of young men with desire and ambition trying to get ahead. And then you have the Brahmins, who have been around a long time, older men and older women that have accumulated a lot of power, a lot of status. Now, especially between high status men and young attractive women, you've got a pretty volatile combination there. Now, at the end of his grope, now we can all agree, shouldn't have laid a hand on these ladies. Maybe you're all gonna have to do the Keanu Reeves hand thing. You can Google that. Rick showed it to me. If you're smart, you won't marry, and you'll be scrupulous about your institutional dynamics, because those are the only ways that power dynamics are enforceable. So, on one hand, if you're in your 60s and you marry someone in their 20s or 30s, some people will tisk and other people will applaud. In the Christian Reformed Church, we've sure acted like this is a confessional issue. In fact, it's now about the only issue you'll get kicked out of ministry for. So, confession? If we're not maintaining our confessions, implicit confessions will emerge and govern. And that's what's happening. And in some ways, the Human Sexuality Report is making the de facto point. Yeah, it's a confession. And what's happening now in sort of the burning down the house strategy of, well, we're going to break the rules and dare people to discipline us and see if there's enough vitality in the institution to muster itself for a hard no instead of just a, That's the strategy, because they can't win with votes. Now, the crisis of progressive liberationism is that there is no terminal ideal. So, full means full. And if you keep following that, well, quite frankly, high status heterosexual men, we have plenty of sociological evidence that they'd prefer to not be monogamous. Or at least we might derive a sexual identity of non-monogamy. That doesn't seem like an unreasonable sexual identity. In fact, that sexual identity seems to be the default sexual identity. Monogamy is, in fact, an achievement, and one that often requires a community to sustain at a communal level. It's an ideal. And so I keep asking progressives on this topic, tell me your terminal ideal. I don't use those words. I'm going to use those words now because I hadn't thought of it in this way. Tell me your terminal ideal. That opens up the door to another thing that we've been noticing about, well, again, what I call progressive liberationism, is that a purity culture ensues. Now, again, when I say purity culture in this area, people right away go to this weirdness in evangelicalism of purity rings and purity culture, and the progressives are constantly decrying it. Nadia Bolz-Weber, makes a vagina trophy and gives it to Gloria Steinem in celebration of melting down these weird, what kind of father gives his daughter a purity ring? That's just weird. The difficulty they have is that without a terminal ideal and an end point, something that is archetypal, something you can't get around, you just keep going. And that just keep going, because most of our lives can't sustain true weirdness, because our desire for stability and order, we just won't live with as much chaos as certain fringe individuals are willing to live with. So your quest for a romantic ideal will probably lead out of relationships only to at some point in the future regret it. I have to follow my heart. I have to follow my secret sacred self. I have to follow. I'm always on the path for my ideal soulmate. usually what happens is you burn through a few relationships and then you start to regret old relationships, and you're still looking, but your 50-year-old self can't, unless you're of uber high status, isn't gonna, if you're a male, attract the 20-something. And then you're at a situation where you got all these 50-year-old men looking for younger women, all these older women kind of aged out, and they're trying to look as young as they can, and everybody on both sides are chasing money. I see that with the seniors. Old men without money are looking for old women with money. Old women, the old men with money can get young women. I mean, it's this marketplace. We don't want this marketplace. It is less ideal than one man, one woman for life, intergenerational, broad spectrum. And yeah, there's problems with it. And yeah, we all fail it. And yeah, and for all practical purposes, some people can't participate in it. And now, my preference for the Christian Reformed Church would be, at least at this point, let local churches keep the ideal. Because if you throw away the ideal, you're not going to go anywhere. And you're going to have to deal with individual cases as they come and figure out what's the best that can be had and done. But you can't monkey with the ideal, because if you give up the ideal, you not only invite way more disorder, but you also will invoke a purity quest. Well, what does that mean? Well, a friend on Voices wrote a post and said, well, okay, because people were countering some of my arguments. So it's just a slippery slope argument. All right, in some ways it is. But he said, yeah, but once we do with same-sex marriage what we did with women in office, now suddenly we're going to have to rewrite forms. And you're going to have all these marriage forms that are, do you take this woman? Do you take this man? No, that's going to get rewritten. And that's not the only thing that's going to get rewritten, because there's actually more going on beneath these other ideals than just this one little substitution. And then, just like we saw with women in office, now you've got pastors who are for and pastors who are against. And increasingly, there's going to be animosity between those two groups within the house. It's exactly what we've seen with women in office. And then it's going to be more pure, or pure enough along these lines. So, okay, 2 men, 1 man, 1 woman. All right. Are we going to police, because we're already not doing it, are we going to police the sexuality of singles? And then how about the sexuality of single clergy? What if I decide, I'm done with my wife, I'm done with my marriage, I'm going to get rid of her, and I'm going to take a church, I'm just going to date. Oh, now we're going to have rules about clergy dating in church. We're going to have a rule that a single minister may not date anyone in his church. You say, well, that sounds like a good rule. Power dynamics and all. Okay. So let's say a single clergy starts dating someone who isn't in their church. You know what everybody in church is going to say? We want to meet your girlfriend. And you know what they would actually like? They'd like the girlfriend to start coming to church so that she can then be enfolded into the community. And then, but then let's say the girlfriend moves into the pastor's house, the parsonage. Well, how do you feel about the pastor and his girlfriend living in the parsonage as if they're married and they're not married? How do you feel about that? We're going to have rules about that. And it just keeps going. What if the pastor says, I'm poly? Full means full. Poly is an identity. Poly is a gender identity. What if the pastor says, well, I like my girlfriend living with me, but sometimes we invite others to come over. Okay, we have a rule. You can't invite others that aren't in the church. Well, let's say they start inviting others on a regular basis, and their poly has 3 or 4 people in it. Can they all move into the parsonage? And then, the pastor's other girlfriend, she's a part of this church, so she starts coming to church. But then the pastor breaks up with one of them. I mean, that's a slippery slope argument. Yeah, but just looking around society, look at Governor Cuomo. There's no terminal ideal. And what one man, one woman for life is a terminal ideal. It's archetypal. You can't get around it. You can't get better than it. And so that's why it's properly at the top of the hierarchy. Now, again, churches deal with things that are less than ideal all the time and figure out ways to deal with it. But if you give up on the ideal, you don't know where you're going. And that's where this is going. And now prove me wrong. I'm open to hear. And I keep challenging people. Show me your terminal ideal. They say, well, 2 people for life. I think that ship has sailed. What we've actually got are competing slippery slopes, because only stable archetypal ideals can arrest a slide. And then what you actually do is reinitiate an uphill aspirational dynamic, which is part of what we don't like. Because once we have this ideal, we all begin to realize that, as Jordan Peterson keeps saying, that ideal judges you. And so, but that dynamic mobilizes a community to actually hold each other accountable in order to achieve that ideal. Let's look at sobriety. The ideal is sobriety. People waver with it. And you have this dynamic in AA. So the ideal is sobriety with respect to alcohol. Okay. So someone who's had trouble with alcohol joins AA, and now they're alcohol free, but they're sleeping all over the place. Or they're eating like mad. Or they're, how many other addictive behaviors. And what they'll say is, no, sobriety is a bigger ideal than just about alcohol. And you need a community in order to achieve it. And, AA has often figured out that a good way to manage the judgment, and, it's not perfect either, but it's in a sense the opposite polarity. The opposite polarity is if you have a stable archetypal ideal, slides get arrested because you have an ideal. You have a fixed point. And if you don't have that fixed point, and again, I don't see the fixed point in marriage equality. If you don't have that fixed point, everything slides. And if you do have that fixed point, you now have the reverse dynamic where you have everybody struggling uphill. And that's a better dynamic. You see, actually, both sides have a slippery slope. The affirming have the slippery slope of, if we don't adopt this, we'll lose our youth. Okay, so you're going to adopt 2 people for life. But, with divorce, you're already wobbled on the for life. But, again, everybody wants for life, because you don't rent a church and gather your friends and bring in a minister to stand up and say, I like her now. No. You invoke an ideal, which is why you invoke the symbolism of an ideal, which is why either it's in a church where there's the marriage is, well, that's what the church is about. It's about an ideal. Or now people are going to a destination, so they go to a beautiful location. Now you're invoking a beauty ideal, but it's all about an ideal. And marriage equality is going to have to come up with an ideal, or these purity dynamics are going to take over, and it's going to get eaten from within. And so the slippery slope argument of the affirming, which is we're using our youth, losing our youth. The trads have, if we give in, we'll lose our moorings. We're always dealing on slippery slopes. If you go on affirming, you will likely initiate the purity dynamic along the lines of the new implicit liberationist ideals. In other words, there's always an ideal out there that we're pursuing. In fact, multiple ideas nested together, deeply intertwined. The local option doesn't satisfy in the Christian Reformed Church. We know that from women in office, because women clergy are annoyed at those classes and pastors who don't agree that they should be in office. And so they're doing violence against me by withholding their approval. And the complementarians in the denomination are annoyed when the seminary puts out something like this. Let's celebrate women in ministry. Now, this woman right here, my Sunday school teacher. She, the pastor of the church my father was in for 36 years. This woman right here, this one right here, another good friend of mine. These are my people, okay? And again, I'm on the pro-women in office side, so I celebrate, but the political compromise that the denomination took, it didn't finally manage any of this. You're going to have to come up with an ideal, or it's just going to continue. And the local option with respect to this, I think we've seen in enough denominations, it doesn't hold. Disciplined pastor in churches who won't sufficiently affirm, or won't affirm whatever the new thing is. You're going to have purity in your new confessionalism. Church adapts a new confession. It's new gender-free liturgies, everything. I mean, confessionalism is in some way inevitable, and it's partly the way that the community holds itself together, because what confessions do is actually attempt to articulate the ideals that are energizing the community and hold them out there. And so when churches, either their confessions are too implicit, or their confessions have gotten stale, or their confessions have gotten too rigid, they cease to function in the community in a way that holds it together. Because again, the way churches work is that in any community is that you have an ideal, that you're striving for that ideal. And that ideal may be many things. I mean, the NRA, their ideal is, to resist gun legislation. The ideal of Planned Parenthood, they have an ideal. Anti-abortion groups, they have ideals. I mean, everybody's got ideals. And the only way an organization actually manages to do all of this, to mobilize people and bring them together, is if there's a great amount of desire for those ideas. Now, there can also be a great amount of fear. And again, looking at Chris Williamson's, parasitic organizations, in that here's something we want to fight against. Something, even a good thing, let's say polio. So you have the March of Dimes to fight against polio, and then you beat polio. Well, then your organization decides it's going to fight. I mean, there's a lot of dynamics in here, but aspirational ideals stimulate stability in groups. They hold groups together. Male, female, for life is a difficult aspiration. That's obvious from church history, from human history. But it's an archetypal aspiration because I can't think of a better one. And again, a high in openness. If you've got a better one, a better archetype to embody and manage human sexuality, both in terms of group stability and intergenerationally, write it down. Polygamy? I don't think so. Less ideal. Governor Cuomo's first girlfriend? Less ideal. Every single other competitor, when I look at and I just sort of run the math, less ideal. That doesn't mean these other things haven't manifest or haven't been tried or people won't try them. They will. But now we get back to the Protestant question in terms of church. What is church supposed to do? It's supposed to manifest the ideal, because you get the ideal of Christ as, now look at what happens in Christianity. Christ is both the ideal of the individual, and Christ is, Jesus is the ideal of the individual. Christ is the ideal of the community. Because look at what the Apostle Paul says. You are in Christ. Christ in Christianity is a collective. And so that's why you've got the homo duplex, and why all of these dynamics in the mega church and other churches are working. We use groups in order to achieve difficult things together. Groups make up for individual insufficiencies. The Apostle Paul calls that spiritual gifts. Sexual desire is always an issue in groups. Jordan Peterson's video, Can Men and Women Work Together in the Workplace? That's an old variant of how do men and women do in church? I was watching with Rick a black church on YouTube, very popular church on Sunday morning, 4,000 people in there for the live stream. Men sit on one side, women sit on another side. People in groups have been trying to manage human sexuality, always aspirationally, always imperfectly, for all of human history. It's tremendously difficult. Sexual desire is always an issue in groups. Male-female for life is the most stable ideal that allows groups to minimize disruption. And here's a test case. Ever watched Bachelor, Bachelorette, Bachelors in Paradise? Most of you haven't. I've watched some of them now. You know the thing that I thought of immediately? Why isn't there an LGBTQ Bachelor, Bachelorette? Just think that through a minute. So you've got one high-status, good-looking person, and you've got all these people that are attracted to them who are also high status, very good looking, very desirable. That's the energy that the show uses. And they all want to be on Instagram and make a lot of money too. And that's the hypocrisy of the entire endeavor. What if you have gay bachelor? What's going to happen? Are you going to be able to keep the tension between the contestants and the goal? No. All these people are going to pair off. Because the way it works is you've got the bachelor living alone, and you've got all of the women seeking the one person and the competition for them. That only works if all of the women decide they want a man, and you've reduced the pool to one. Bachelorette, inversed. It doesn't work in any other configuration. The gays and lesbians will all start pairing off down below here and lose interest in The Bachelor. The show falls apart. And I think that's a microcosm of society in general. You're probably not going to be able to manage human sexuality apart from this ideal archetype. Now, again, please don't misunderstand me. You've got an ideal, and you've got what to do with all of us who fail the ideal. And that's what we live with. Divorce is when you fail the ideal. But giving up on the ideal by saying that there's no valence difference between who you're attracted to. Now, it might not be that you can change it. And for many of us, it's not that we can change who's attracted to us if you're single and looking to mate or reproduce or start a family or have a stable partner for life. There are problems all throughout it, but in a very Pejoian way, the ideal is the ideal, and we're stuck with it, no matter how we think or feel about it. And how we deal with the less than ideal is pretty much how we deal with everything in life. Now, some of you can look at this video and say, wow, John Paul II, Roman Catholic's perspective, reproduction as a part of the package of the ideal. Is Paul going Roman Catholic? No. Because as John Van Donk sort of says, I tweak it a little bit, most of life's escapist solutions are exchanging one set of problems for another. Part of the power of the Roman Catholic vision that the church can't seem to even fully embrace herself is there's a certain logic to it. That this is the ideal. And Protestants, Orthodox, and Roman Catholics need each other, because now you might look at what I said about Protestantism and say, see? In many ways, what we went through was inevitable. And again, I think some of the countries in Europe decided to have a reformation. France had a revolution. Some of these dynamics are inescapable, and they're always inescapable, regardless of how well we can articulate the ideal. Because again, back to Pejo and Peterson, it's not whether we can articulate the ideal. What we really desire to do is inhabit the ideal. And we need each other for that. And so we all do need each other for that. Conflict is how we learn and how we pray for unity. Now, you express your ideal by what you're willing to risk for it. Reformed Church of America, they've been dealing with the burning down the house strategy for those who wanted the Reformed Church of America to go full affirming. And the house is burning down. And there are now the Alliance of Reformed Churches are peeling off many Reformed Church of America churches. And at the head of that organization are people I know, people I've worked with. One of them, born and raised CRC, eventually began working for the RCA when we were collaborating. Another one, I got meeting with RCA projects that I had collaborated with and worked with. A lot of people in the CRC are watching the RCA house burn down and say, what can we do so our house doesn't burn down? It's going to be a mess. But you express your ideal by what you're willing to risk for it. And it's that energy that actually creates, and in the case of the ARC, a new, are they a denomination? Are they an alliance? What is that? And the beat goes on with all of these things. So there's my argument. I think marriage equality leads to the death of Protestant churches because if you lose the ideal, you will lose the power that communal striving for the ideal affords the organization. Now, does that mean that every church that goes affirming will fold immediately? No. But I think generally speaking, you want to talk about power dynamics? I think this is a power dynamic. And I think it's part of the reason why, at least by some demographers, the last Episcopalian has already been born. Because in order for an organization, any organization, not just a church, in order for an organization to have vitality and life and act in some ways like a living organism, again, see my conversation with Vervaeke and JP, there needs to be a dynamism that moves it forward. And I think what you have with one man, one woman for life is an archetypal ideal. And if you lose that ideal, and let's say even if your other ideal is implicit, I think you're going to trigger these purity dynamics that we're already beginning to see. And I think you're not going to be able to harness the kind of motivational dynamics that, in fact, the church has used to grow ever since there have been churches. So that's my argument. And once I stop this video, I'll see how long it is. It's a long one. So I know most of you sort of crapped out early, but some of you are long listeners, so there it is. Can't wait to see what you have to say in the comments.